before he could legally sign his own school field trip form, before he even knew what algebra was. An 11-year-old boy walked into American history not as a student, not as a victim, but as one of the youngest people ever charged with murder as an adult. And decades later, after rehabilitation, after national outrage, after becoming a symbol of broken systems and broken children, Nathaniel Abraham would face the world again. Only this time, the cameras weren't waiting to save him. They were waiting to ask one question: did we create a monster or fail a child? Welcome to Beyond the Case. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the cases that still echo today. Now let's go back to the moment America realized a child could be charged like a grown man. Late 1997, Pontiac, Michigan. Police swarm a middle school classroom. Students freeze. Teachers stare in disbelief. Because the officer isn't here for drugs, he isn't here for a fight. He isn't here for a frightened runaway. He's here for a suspected murderer. A child. 11 years old. Barely 4 feet tall. And by the end of the day, the country will erupt: politicians, civil rights leaders, parents, experts, all split down the center. Was he a cold-blooded killer? Or a broken boy shaped by poverty, chaos, and a system that ignored every warning sign until it was too late? But to understand why an entire neighborhood said they weren't surprised, why prosecutors wanted him locked away forever, and why one man, just one, believed he could still be saved, we need to go back. Way back. Pontiac, Michigan. 1986. Nathaniel Abraham enters the world already fighting uphill. 6 children. A single mother, working 2 exhausting jobs. A missing father who never returned. A home where love existed, sure. But supervision? Structure? Almost none. Neighbors would later say, he was tiny, but he was trouble. Not mischievous trouble. Not childhood roughhousing. But violent, escalating, impulsive trouble. By age 9, he had 22 police encounters. Arson. Assault. Breaking and entering. Threatening neighbors. Threatening kids. Beating a 14-year-old with a steel pipe. Fighting a bus driver. One neighbor who eventually moved away because of him said something that would haunt the future. One day, that boy's gonna kill somebody. A chilling prophecy. One that prosecutors would later echo in court. But there was another, darker force shaping Nate's world. The late 1980s and early 90s were unlike any period in modern American crime history. Violence skyrocketed. Homicides doubled. Juveniles increasingly carried firearms. Drugs didn't just destroy families, they created armies. Kids as young as 9 became lookouts, carriers, couriers. They worked cheap, took risks, drew little suspicion. And with the drug economy came guns. Lots of guns. By 1994, more than 80% of juvenile homicide cases involved firearms. Nathaniel Abraham was a product of that world. No father, an overstretched mother begging authorities for help. No mental health support. No intervention. Just a child growing up in the perfect storm. Poverty, crime, violence, and a legal system preparing a new battlefield. Because by the time Nate committed his crime, Michigan had passed one of the harshest juvenile laws in America, allowing any age, even 4 years old, to be tried as adults for violent crimes. No minimum. No safeguard. A ticking clock toward a historic collision. It begins with a stolen rifle. A rusted, unstable, .22 caliber gun. Nate, now 11, fires shots at a neighbor's house. Then, from a cluster of trees near a convenience store, more shots. 200 feet away, 18-year-old Ronnie Green is walking. A bullet hits him in the head. He collapses. He doesn't die instantly, he fights for nearly 24 hours. And then the news breaks. A teenager is dead. A child is a suspect. Witnesses say Nate bragged afterward. His girlfriend claims he said earlier that week, "I'm going to shoot somebody." When police confront him, he admits to firing the gun, but insists he was only trying to hit light bulbs. An accident, he says. But prosecutors, they say otherwise. And by Halloween morning, officers walk into his 6th grade class and read him his rights. America is stunned. But Pontiac? Pontiac shrugs. Charging an 11-year-old as an adult sparks an instant firestorm. Civil rights leaders protest. Amnesty International condemns it. Youth advocates call it barbaric. But community members who lived near Nate, they cheer, they demand protection, they demand justice. Only one neighbor defends him, saying, he needs help, not life in prison. Enter Jeffrey Feger, the lawyer famous for defending Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He takes Nate's case for free. The trial begins after 2 years of delays. Nate, now 13, appears tiny in oversized prison clothing, shackled, confused. Prosecutors present him as cunning. Feger presents him as a mentally delayed child with an IQ of 70, functioning like a 6-year-old. Expert marksmen argue he couldn't have intended the shot from 200 feet. Prosecutors counter with witnesses who say he practiced aiming at houses. It's a legal tug-of-war unlike anything the country had seen. A child being judged by adult standards, by an adult jury, under a law written for adult criminals. And then, the moment that shocks everyone, the jury rejects first-degree murder. They find him guilty of second-degree murder. He becomes the youngest American ever convicted of murder as an adult. But the judge does something unexpected. Instead of 25 years in prison, she chooses the lenient option. Nate will go to juvenile detention until age 21. Then he will walk free. Hope returns. But hope isn't the same as healing. To the world, Nate begins transforming. He earns good grades. He earns a GED, a diploma, leadership roles, a job at Goodwill, praise from supervisors. But behind the scenes, he battles anger, fights, theft, impulsive outbursts. Not criminal, but not resolved. Psychologists later say he left the system without the deep therapy required for trauma, violence exposure, and neurological delay. Still, on January 18, 2007, Nathaniel Abraham walks out of juvenile detention. A free man. Cameras cheer. Reporters swarm. Advocates claim victory. But reintegration is a steep climb. And no one knew how steep it truly was. Because the next chapter in Nate's life would divide public opinion all over again. When Nathaniel Abraham stepped out of juvenile detention at 21 years old, the cameras caught a young man smiling awkwardly into microphones, blinking into a world that felt too bright, too loud, too fast. Advocates celebrated him as proof that rehabilitation worked. Critics warned that the system had simply paused the inevitable. But the truth? Nathaniel walked into freedom with no real map, no stable foundation, and no blueprint for rebuilding a life interrupted at age 11. For a brief moment, he tried. He enrolled in programs. He spoke softly in interviews. He told reporters he wanted to help kids avoid the path he walked. He dreamed of becoming a youth mentor. But dreams alone don't fix a fractured childhood. And the world outside didn't wait for him to catch up. Within months, the cracks began to show. He struggled to find consistent work. He bounced between temporary housing and short-term plans. Every time he tried to build something steady, the weight of his past followed right behind him. Then came the first wave of trouble. Police contacts, minor altercations, slip-ups that didn't make national headlines, but signaled a steady unraveling. The microhook emerged quietly. Was this the beginning of a pattern, or just the stress of a young man unprepared for adulthood? The answer arrived sooner than anyone expected. Barely a year and a half after his release, police responded to an incident that put Nathaniel back into the spotlight. This time the charge wasn't murder, it was possession of a firearm. A painful irony. The very object that destroyed his childhood had returned. He insisted he wasn't planning to harm anyone. He claimed it wasn't even his. But for the justice system, the symbolism was undeniable. The boy once deemed too dangerous to live among others was again surrounded by weapons. The public split all over again. Some said, "See, this is who he always was." Others insisted, "Of course this happened, he got no support." Nathaniel pleaded no contest. He faced consequences, but not the kind that sent him away forever. For a moment, observers hoped this would be the wake-up call that pushed him back on track. But the pattern continued. New charges followed over the years, nonviolent, yet troubling. Drug-related possession, police confrontations, a growing list of small infractions that painted a picture of a man drifting further from the rehabilitative promise his teenage progress once suggested. Each incident became a micro-reveal. What if the boy the system tried to fix simply walked out with different wounds, invisible, but just as deep. Still, there were glimmers. Times he tried again. Times he attempted music. Times he spoke about wanting peace, wanting stability, wanting a normal life. But trauma and instability do not loosen their grip easily. And then came the most recent twist, the one that pushed Nathaniel back into headlines and reopened the debate about childhood crime, rehabilitation, and lifelong consequences. He was arrested again, this time on charges connected to drugs. Not the violent crimes of his childhood, but still a sign of spiraling. Police reports described a man caught in cycles of poor decisions, survival mode, and an environment that had never stopped pulling at him. The debate reignited immediately. Critics argued he was destined for this. The judge was wrong. Advocates countered fiercely. He was never given real therapy, never given structured reintegration, never given a chance. And through it all, Nathaniel himself remained a quiet, complicated figure, neither the monster his harshest critics claimed, nor the miracle case his supporters once hoped for. Today, the most recent publicly available information shows a man who is still struggling not with violence, not with the cold-blooded reputation he was branded with as a child, but with the everyday battles of adulthood shaped by trauma, poverty, and a system that began failing him long before the crime that changed everything. He lives mostly out of the spotlight now, occasionally interviewed, occasionally filmed, often misunderstood. The childhood prophecy that he would kill somebody someday did come true, and that tragedy will always remain the center of this case. But the larger question, the one that still divides America, is this: did Nathaniel Abraham destroy a life at age 11 because he was dangerous? Or because the world around him was? That is the uncomfortable truth this case forces us to confront. A child pulled the trigger, but it took a system, a neighborhood, a nation of policy failures to create the boy who picked up the gun. And decades later, the echoes of that gunshot continue. Nathaniel Abraham had been free for only a handful of days when the weight of the world began to settle onto his shoulders. The flashes from reporters' cameras illuminated a young man who had never truly lived outside a fence, outside a schedule, outside the tightly controlled structure of a juvenile facility. He wasn't accustomed to the noise of traffic. He wasn't accustomed to the complexity of choices. He wasn't accustomed to the world expecting him to suddenly understand adulthood simply because the calendar said he was grown. Supporters celebrated him as a living example of rehabilitation. Critics warned that statistics were against him. To viewers at home, his soft-spoken voice and uneasy smile made him appear shy, withdrawn, almost gentle. But that was the problem. What the world saw was a 21-year-old man. What the world didn't see was that on the inside, Nathaniel was still the boy who had entered confinement at age 11, the boy whose development froze at the moment the justice system swallowed him. He was physically older. Emotionally, he was still a scared kid with no roadmap. This internal disconnect became the foundation of everything that followed. The first microhook emerges. Would Nathaniel continue the path that his juvenile counselors believed in? Or would he return to the chaos that shaped him? The unseen battle of re-entry. Re-entry into society is one of the hardest transitions any incarcerated youth faces, but for Nathaniel, it was 10 times harder. Most youth offenders spend a few years in supervision, not a full childhood. Nathaniel didn't know how to manage a bank account. He didn't know how to fill out rental applications. He didn't know how to navigate friendships or romantic relationships that weren't regulated by facility rules. He didn't know how to handle the adult world's expectations of him, expectations that were impossibly high because of his name and his past. People expected him to be grateful. People expected him to be reformed. People expected him to represent the best outcome of the juvenile system. But nobody asked whether he was emotionally prepared to live without constant supervision. His struggles appeared almost immediately. He tried living with family, but household tensions rose. He tried volunteer work. He tried job training. He tried faith-based programs. But the world he had left at age 11 was not the world he returned to at 21. Phones were different. Jobs required skills he didn't have. Detroit's economy had cratered. Crime was still prevalent. And the people he once knew had grown into adults who didn't always understand him or trust him. In interviews, he often said, "I'm trying, I'm really trying." And he was. But trying wasn't enough. Not for someone who had never lived as a free adolescent. Not for someone who had never learned the social and emotional skills other children learned naturally. Not for someone who was nationally infamous before he could even spell second-degree murder. And just one mistake, one wrong environment, one wrong friend, one wrong impulse threatened to unravel everything. The first slip, a warning sign ignored. 18 months after his release, he faced his first major setback. Police discovered him in possession of a firearm. To the public, this was a devastating symbol, almost poetic in a tragic way. The very object that destroyed his childhood had once again appeared in his life. To Nathaniel, it was something else entirely. It was a survival instinct. Not to kill, but to exist. The neighborhoods he could afford to live in were dangerous. The people around him were often unpredictable. And the fear of being a target because of his past, because of his name, because of how much he had been on TV, was real. Still, the law did not care about symbolism or circumstance. He was charged. He faced the system again. He received probation, monitoring, and another label. Adult offender. This event didn't make national headlines like his childhood case, but locally, it reignited old conversations. See, he was always a problem. He had every chance. He blew it. He wasn't ready for freedom. He needed long-term therapy, not punishment. No one agreed. No one held the full truth. Because the full truth was much more complicated. Nathaniel was never taught how to live in the world. He was only taught how to follow rules inside it. The downward slope. After the firearm case, Nathaniel tried to regroup. He attempted music. He spoke about turning his story into motivation for kids. He attended community events intended to inspire troubled teens. But behind the scenes, the world tightened around him. Jobs were difficult to keep. The stigma of being the boy murderer followed him everywhere. People recognized him in grocery stores. People whispered about him in line. People avoided him, judged him, feared him. He was physically free, but socially trapped. Then came the next twist. Drug-related charges. While nonviolent, these charges revealed something deeper. A man struggling with coping, with identity, with internal chaos he didn't know how to name. Many former juvenile offenders develop substance issues later in life. It's not because they're inherently criminal. It's because drugs offer something the system never gave them. Escape. Nathaniel was arrested again. And again. Each time, varying levels of severity. Each time, reinforcing the public narrative that he was a lost cause. But the micro-reveal inside these events was something few people noticed. Nathaniel's adult crimes were not violent. Not assault. Not gunfire. Not murder. They were signs of a man drowning, not attacking. Yet society rarely distinguishes the two. A broken narrative, the public, and the myth. Decades after his trial, many Americans still believe Nathaniel was a cold, unrepentant killer. But interviews, psychological evaluations, and post-release footage show something very different. He was a child with neurological delays. A child with impulse problems. A child surrounded by violence. A child who begged for help through behavior adults ignored. A child who faced a justice system more interested in punishment than intervention. A child whose mother pleaded for support and was turned away. By the time the system acted, it was too late, not because he was inherently evil, but because the adults meant to help him failed every step of the way. And as a man, he paid for their failures with every new arrest, every setback, every struggle to stabilize his life. The most recent twist, a man still fighting. The most recent publicly known updates paint a picture of a man who is still trying, still searching, still attempting to find footing in a world that shaped him through trauma and incarceration. He has spoken in interviews about feeling misunderstood. He has talked about wanting to avoid trouble. He has expressed regret for the life he lived and the life he lost. He has admitted confusion, anger, frustration, and despair. And yet, he still hopes for redemption. Some see him as a threat who never changed. Others see him as a tragic figure abandoned by the systems meant to help him. But Nathaniel's story is not about what people want to believe. It is about what society refuses to confront. When a child commits a serious crime, the world demands answers. But when that child becomes an adult shaped by trauma the world created, the world suddenly looks away. The question that lingers is not whether Nathaniel Abraham was dangerous at age 11. The real question is, Who taught him to be? And who takes responsibility for the man he became? The ending that has no end. Today, Nathaniel lives outside the spotlight, battling the same forces that shaped him before he ever touched a gun. Poverty, trauma, stigma, lack of support, unresolved psychological struggles, and the ghost of a case that made him infamous before he entered puberty. His life is neither a story of perfect redemption nor one of inevitable downfall. It is a story still unfolding, a story that exposes one of the most uncomfortable truths about America. It is possible to save a child. But it is harder to save a child once the world decides he is already lost. And that is the tragedy behind the headlines. Nathaniel Abraham was not born a killer. He was born into a world that taught him violence long before any courtroom tried to teach him justice. And decades later, he is still trying to understand who he is. The boy the world feared? The man the world abandoned? Or the human being still fighting to rewrite the only story he ever knew? Freedom is supposed to feel wide and open. But for Nathaniel Abraham, it felt like walking through a hallway lined with invisible tripwires, each one connected to a headline that had already been written for him. Everywhere he went, eyes followed. Not openly, not rudely, but cautiously. People recognized him without saying a word, and the air around them shifted. They tensed, they whispered, they moved differently. He felt it all. He once admitted in an interview that the hardest part of freedom wasn't the responsibilities, it was the silence. The way people stared but never spoke. The way employers took one look at his name and suddenly the job was no longer available. The way neighbors introduced themselves politely, then avoided him. There is a loneliness that only infamous people understand, especially those who became infamous as children. Nathaniel didn't just carry a criminal record, he carried a myth. The myth of the 11-year-old murderer. The myth of the boy who shot with intention. The myth of the child prosecutors, painted as cold and calculated. And myths are heavier than truth. They are also harder to escape. At first, he tried to outrun it. He tried signing up for vocational programs. He tried construction work. He tried community centers. He even tried rapping, writing lyrics about being misunderstood, about surviving a childhood that no one else had lived. But the past is not something you can outrun. Not when it follows you everywhere. Not when it knows your name. Not when it built you. The more he tried to rebuild his life, the more he realized that the world wasn't ready to let him. And that realization created the second major turning point in his adulthood. The tightening circle. People often assume that prison is the hardest part of incarceration, but for many formerly incarcerated youth, the hardest part is everything that comes after. The employment rejections. The parole check-ins. The financial instability. The old friends returning with new habits. The new acquaintances who only see you as a curiosity. The constant pressure to prove you've changed. The constant fear of failing. Nathaniel had never built independence. He had never formed adult friendships outside the system. He had never been taught life planning, financial literacy, or emotional regulation. Inside juvenile detention, schedules were rigid. Staff controlled conflict. Rules controlled movement. Counselors controlled therapy. Outside, Nathaniel had to control everything himself, and he didn't have the skills. The decline was subtle at first. He stopped showing up to programs consistently. He drifted between job applications. The optimism from release day interviews faded. And that's when familiar faces from his old environment began resurfacing. People who saw him as the kid they used to know, not the adult he was trying to become. People who lived the same cycles he had once been pulled into. People who had easier access to the streets than any structured path. They didn't force him. They didn't pressure him. But for someone who grew up without stability, familiar chaos feels safer than unfamiliar peace. And slowly, Nathaniel drifted. The gun that changed everything again. The next major incident, the firearm possession, didn't just mark a legal turning point. It marked an emotional one. For the public, it was proof of failure. For the justice system, it was confirmation. For Nathaniel, it was a lifeline he grabbed without thinking. He wasn't carrying it to harm. He wasn't planning another violent act. He was carrying it for the same reason most young men in unstable environments do. Fear. Fear of being targeted. Fear of being robbed. Fear of being recognized as the kid murderer. Fear of not being able to defend himself. People rarely realize this, but former notorious offenders face danger long after release. Some people want revenge. Some want to provoke. Some simply want to test them. Nathaniel lived with that tension every single day. But the law cannot measure fear. It only measures action. The micro-reveal here is often overlooked. Even when he was arrested for possessing a gun, he did not fire it. He did not threaten anyone with it. He did not repeat his childhood actions. He had grown just not enough, and not in the right direction. After the arrest, he faced probation conditions that made life even harder. Mandatory check-ins, restrictions on movement, increased supervision, all of which made employment, education, and stability even more difficult. And the cycle tightened further. The decline that no one stopped. After the firearm case, Nathaniel spiraled. Not dramatically, not explosively, but quietly, like someone losing their grip on a rope that was already frayed. He drifted in and out of small-time trouble. Drug possession, disorderly conduct, minor confrontations with police, periods of instability. None of these were violent. None involved guns or weapons. None harmed anyone. But each one chipped away at him. Each one reminded him that society did not see him as Nathaniel, the flawed young man trying to find his footing. It saw him as Nathaniel Abraham, the 11-year-old killer, frozen in time. In criminology, there is a phenomenon called labeling theory. It argues that once society labels someone as a criminal, especially at a young age, others treat them according to that label. Eventually, the person internalizes it. For Nathaniel, the label had been placed before he could spell it, and the internalization was inevitable. This leads to another micro-twist. Nathaniel didn't become dangerous. He became hopeless. Hopelessness leads people to make impulsive decisions. Hopelessness leads people into environments that feel familiar. Hopelessness leads people to self-medicate, to isolate, to stop trying. Hopelessness is not violence. Hopelessness is decay. And the decay deepened with every passing year. The interviews that revealed a different man. As Nathaniel moved into his late 20s and early 30s, he participated in interviews that gave the public a clearer picture of the man behind the headlines. He wasn't boastful. He wasn't cold. He wasn't remorseless. He was tired. Tired of being judged. Tired of being recognized. Tired of being unable to move past an event that happened before he ever reached adolescence. One interviewer described him as a young man who looks lost in his own story. And that description fits. He spoke about wanting to stay out of trouble. He spoke about wanting stability. He spoke about wanting peace. But he also spoke about confusion, about anger, about the weight of his reputation. In one conversation, he said, "I feel like I never got to be me. I was always what people said I was." Those words encapsulate the psychological wound at the center of his life. He didn't know how to separate himself from the crime that defined him. And without that separation, forward progression was nearly impossible. The latest turn and what it really means. Recent public records indicate that Nathaniel faced additional legal issues connected to drugs. Again, nonviolent. Again, indicative of coping issues and environmental pressures. To some people, this proves that rehabilitation failed. To others, it proves he was never rehabilitated in the first place. He was simply contained. The deeper truth lies somewhere in the middle. Nathaniel Abraham was rehabilitated in the way the juvenile system understands rehabilitation. He learned discipline. He learned routines. He learned academic skills. But he did not receive what modern experts now understand is crucial: long-term trauma therapy, neurodevelopmental treatment, cognitive behavioral support, transition planning, stable long-term mentorship, a structured re-entry program customized for extreme cases. In short, he was taught how to survive detention. He was not taught how to survive life. And the consequences of that gap echo through every mistake he has made as an adult. A man caught between worlds. Today, Nathaniel is not simply a symbol of juvenile crime. He is a symbol of the uncomfortable truth few people want to acknowledge. A child can commit a terrible crime, but still not be a monster. A child can kill, but still be a victim of failures beyond his control. A child can grow into an adult who is not violent, but still suffers the consequences of a violent childhood. Nathaniel lives in this contradiction. He embodies the debate between punishment and rehabilitation, between fear and compassion, between justice and humanity. People who knew him as a child remember a troubled boy. People who know him as an adult describe a complicated man. People who only know the headlines see neither, they see a caricature. So where does that leave him? Somewhere in the middle, somewhere uncertain, somewhere between redemption and tragedy. The one thing absolutely clear is this: his story did not end when he left juvenile detention. It did not end when reporters stopped covering him. It did not end when the judges delivered his final sentence. It continues messy, painful, human. The story of a boy who shot a stranger and changed the legal landscape. The story of a boy who became a man without becoming whole. The story of a man still fighting the invisible battle he began at birth. Nathaniel Abraham is not the same 11-year-old who once held a rifle. But neither is he the rehabilitated success story the system celebrated at 21. He is something far harder to categorize. A man paying the price for a crime he committed, and for the life he inherited. As Nathaniel moved deeper into adulthood, something subtle but powerful began shaping the trajectory of his life. Something that rarely appears in legal documents, rarely appears in news reports, and rarely appears in public debate. It was the quiet erosion of identity. People forget that when Nathaniel was arrested at 11, he had no real identity yet, no defined personality, no sense of self. Childhood is where identity forms through trial, error, friendships, mistakes, small freedoms, big lessons. Nathaniel didn't have those years. He learned who he was through other people's definitions. The young murderer, the troubled kid, the example case, the symbol of the juvenile justice movement. The boy who should have been locked away forever. Labels given to an 11-year-old became shackles for the adult he grew into. You cannot become someone new if the world refuses to let go of who you were. And the world refused. He felt it every time he applied for a job, and a manager pulled him aside with the kind of nervous politeness that hides fear. He felt it every time he walked into a gas station, and someone whispered or stared too long. He felt it every time he introduced himself, and waited for the moment the person recognized the name. Nathaniel once said, "I feel like I'm always explaining myself for something I did as a kid." But the truth was harsher. He wasn't allowed to evolve beyond that kid. And when someone is denied the chance to become, they often end up returning to what they were. The environments that shape us. People often ask why individuals released from juvenile detention or prison return to dangerous environments. The answer isn't as simple as choice. When Nathaniel left the juvenile system, he did not walk into a stable, middle-class home with therapy services, mentors, financial support, and opportunity. He walked back into the same environment he came from. High crime, few jobs, low income, constant tension, limited upward mobility. Changing behavior is impossible when the environment that shaped the behavior remains the same. This is why experts say, rehabilitation happens in therapy. Recidivism happens in environment. For Nathaniel, the environment was a trap disguised as home. And although he tried to distance himself from negative influences, the gravitational pull of familiarity was powerful. Humans return to what they understand, even if it hurts them. Especially when support systems are thin. The juvenile system provided rigid structure. Society provided none. And structure is something Nathaniel desperately needed. Without it, his life became a series of scattered attempts to keep moving forward, punctuated by small collapses that brought police back into his orbit. The failure of support systems. Despite the public attention surrounding Nathaniel's case, Michigan never created a specialized long-term plan for him. There was no dedicated reentry team, no state-funded counseling, no multi-year transition program. He received the same minimal reentry services as any other youth who exited the system. But this was not any other youth. This was a child the entire nation had politicized. A child whose case had changed laws, sparked protests, triggered debates that still echo today. The state built an intricate legal battle around him, but not an intricate support network. After release, he attended some community programs. But programs are not the same as ongoing protection. Programs end, caseworkers change, nonprofits lose funding. Stability is fragile when built on temporary systems. And Nathaniel's life rested on temporary systems. The cracks inevitably widened. The internal war, a man against himself. For every external struggle, there was an internal one. Nathaniel spoke openly about feeling stuck between who I was and who I'm trying to be. And that statement revealed more than he realized. Psychologically, he was in a suspended state. Childhood trauma freezes emotional development, and early incarceration reinforces that freeze. Nathaniel learned to survive, but he never learned to heal. He knew he wanted a better life. He did not know how to build one. He knew he wanted stability. He did not know how to trust the world enough to accept it. He knew he wanted peace. He did not know how to silence the noise inside him. This emotional tug-of-war manifested in the erratic choices that followed him into adulthood. Some days, he wanted nothing but calm. Other days, he drifted toward chaos, because chaos was familiar. Some days, he would speak about hope. Other days, hope felt unrealistic. This is not unusual for people who experience trauma early in life. Trauma scientists explain that brains shaped by fear expect danger even when none exists. Nathaniel expected danger. He expected failure. He expected abandonment. So when difficulties arose, he did not see them as temporary setbacks. He saw them as confirmation of everything he feared about himself. And when you expect to fall, you fall faster. What society missed. Whenever Nathaniel was arrested as an adult, people reacted the same way. See, he didn't change. He was always going to be like this. He got a second chance and wasted it. But these arguments miss the most critical context. Nathaniel's brain development was permanently shaped by neglect, instability, neurological delay, and early incarceration. He was never given the therapeutic interventions modern juvenile experts now consider non-negotiable. We must understand what he lacked. Long-term trauma therapy, family-based interventions, cognitive behavioral treatment, positive peer influences, academic mentoring, job placement support, adult mentorship, substance counseling, mental health stabilization, environmental relocation, supervised transitional housing. Without these supports, recidivism is not a mystery. It is predictable, and Nathaniel's story was predictable long before his first misstep in adulthood. The pressure of a narrative too heavy to carry. One of the most unspoken parts of Nathaniel's story is how the media shaped his identity long before he shaped it himself. The headlines repeated like a chant: 11-year-old killer, youngest murder defendant, child tried as adult, prodigy of violence. It didn't matter that expert testimony showed cognitive impairment. It didn't matter that he was one of 6 neglected children. It didn't matter that his mother begged authorities for help years before the crime. It didn't matter that his environment overflowed with weapons, drugs, and delinquency. The story needed a villain. The law needed a test case. The media needed an emotional hook. Nathaniel became all three. And once someone becomes a symbol, humanity gets stripped away. Symbols are judged, not understood. Symbols are debated, not healed. Symbols are used, not supported. Nathaniel became a symbol before he became a teenager. And the human being inside the symbol struggled to find space to exist. The most recent reports, the reality of a man still searching. Public updates over the past decade reveal a man who remains deeply affected by the collision between himself and the law. He has faced drug possession charges. He has been detained for minor infractions. He has expressed frustration with life's lack of direction. And yet, he continues to express desire for something better. From interviews and available records, several truths emerge. He is not violent. He is not aggressive. He is not repeating the type of crime he committed as a child. He is not a threat in the way people once feared. Instead, he struggles with economic instability, emotional instability, inconsistent support, lingering trauma, substance issues, lack of purpose, societal stigma, environmental pressure. Nathaniel Abraham, now an adult, is not the boy prosecutors wanted the world to fear. He is the adult the system never prepared him to become. And the tragedy is that he knows it. He knows he could have been more. He knows he could have lived differently. He knows that his childhood destroyed chances he never had the freedom to explore. And yet he continues to fight for normalcy, even if that fight is messy, imperfect, and filled with missteps. His story is not polished. His path is not linear. His life is not a redemption arc, nor is it a descent into darkness. It is something more honest. A portrait of what happens when society responds to a child's violence with punishment instead of intervention, and then expects the punished child to transform into a functional adult without support. As Nathaniel moved further into adulthood, the world around him continued to shift, while he remained anchored to a childhood he never fully escaped. The strange paradox of his life was this: he was infamous but invisible, recognized but misunderstood, feared but not truly known. The more time passed, the less the public remembered the nuance of his case. They remembered only the headline. And a headline is not a person. But Nathaniel had to live inside that headline every single day. The older he became, the more the weight of that past pressed on him, not through guilt alone, but through isolation. He talked frequently about wanting to be a father, wanting a family, wanting something stable to hold on to. But every attempt to build stability was undermined by two forces: his environment and his reputation. Even when he tried to distance himself from negative influences, he had nowhere new to go. Poverty traps people. Trauma traps people. Stigma traps people. And if all three surround someone from childhood into adulthood, they become nearly impossible to outrun. The trap of familiarity. The most heartbreaking reality for many former juvenile offenders is that freedom often pushes them back into the very places they need to escape. Nathaniel's early 20s were filled with attempted restarts. He would take a job for a few weeks. He would try to enroll in classes. He would try to write music about his life. He would try to set goals. But each restart hit the same barriers: lack of transportation, unstable housing, mental strain, financial pressure, people around him who lived on the edge of the law, people who pulled him back into cycles he didn't want but couldn't resist. One of his old acquaintances once said, "Nate didn't want to be in the streets, but the streets were all he knew." That sentence reveals the core issue: people cannot choose what they have never been taught. Nathaniel didn't know what stable adulthood felt like. He didn't understand slow growth, long-term planning, or delayed gratification. The system had structured his life for him down to the hour until the day he turned 21. Then suddenly, life became a series of decisions he had never been taught to make. That is the most overlooked part of rehabilitating children. We teach them rules. We forget to teach them life. The emotional aftershock of infamy. One of the most revealing interviews Nathaniel ever gave took place years after his release. He spoke candidly about the pressure that followed him. "People think they know me. They know a story, and I'm in it like I don't have a say." There was pain behind those words. But more importantly, there was truth. When a person becomes a case, they lose their humanity in the public eye. Nathaniel became a character in a political debate long before he became an adult trying to survive. Lawmakers used his case to argue for harsher sentences. Advocates used his case to argue for reform. Journalists used his case to stir discussion. Communities used his case as a warning. Everyone used Nathaniel. No one helped Nathaniel. By the time he reached his late 20s, the psychological toll of living under a historic case began showing in his speech, his posture, his interactions. He became guarded, weary, distrustful. People who interviewed him noticed how often he looked down, how often he paused before speaking, how often he seemed unsure whether he should express how he truly felt. Years of being misunderstood had taught him to anticipate hostility. That kind of anticipation shapes behavior. It shapes choices. It shapes a person's entire worldview. Another brush with the law, but not the one the public expected. In the following years, Nathaniel again found himself in contact with the justice system, this time over drug-related issues. The headlines weren't national this time. There were no protests, no political debates, no courtroom sketches aired on national news. It was quieter, almost expected, almost routine. But here is the twist, the part of the story the public never seems to fully grasp. None of his adult charges reflect violence. None reflect aggression. None reflect the behavior that made him infamous as a child. If anything, they reflect the opposite. A man numbing pain, not causing it. A man avoiding conflict, not chasing it. A man alone in instability, not exploding into chaos. Experts who examined his life later explained that many youths who experience long-term confinement, followed by sudden adulthood, face similar patterns. Their struggles are not rooted in malevolence, they are rooted in unhealed trauma and unstructured reintegration. And yet, the public response was predictable. He messed up again. He had every chance. He's a lost cause. But consider the truth. How can someone be a lost cause if they were never given a real chance to begin with? A real chance requires emotional support, social structure, financial guidance, community mentorship, trauma therapy, and environment change. Nathaniel got none of those things. He was released into adulthood with a GED and national notoriety. That was it. The unanswered questions of justice. Nathaniel's life raises a question that few legal systems want to confront. If we judge children as adults, do we accept responsibility when the adult they become is shaped by that judgment? The criminal justice system rarely answers that question honestly. Instead, it assumes that a clean legal slate equals a clean emotional slate. But trauma doesn't reset at 21. Stigma doesn't reset at 21. Brain development interrupted by incarceration doesn't reset at 21. Nathaniel left the system legally rehabilitated. Emotionally, he left wounded. Psychologists often say, youth incarceration pauses childhood but does not replace it. Nathaniel's childhood did not resume when he walked free. It ended forever. And because of that, adulthood became something he had to decipher on his own, often incorrectly, often painfully. The man he is versus the boy the world remembers. To this day, people confuse the man with the myth. They remember an 11-year-old who shot a stranger. They forget the context. They forget the environment. They forget the desperation. They forget the systemic failures that shaped that child. And most importantly, they forget the man he became. The man who has never repeated violent behavior. The man who has never harmed another person since that single tragic day. The man who expresses remorse in ways many never expected from him. The man who fights for stability in a world that refuses to forget what he was at 11 years old. This disconnect creates the most tragic element of his story. He is punished today for the boy he was, even though the man he is bears almost no resemblance to that child. Imagine living your entire adult life paying for something you did before puberty, something you barely understood, something shaped by a world that failed you long before you failed anyone else. That is Nathaniel's existence. A man trapped in a ghost of childhood crime. The societal mirror. Nathaniel Abraham's story is more than one case. It is a reflection. A mirror held up to every system that claims to protect children but only intervenes after harm is done. A mirror held up to every community that labels kids as problems instead of symptoms. A mirror held up to every politician who weaponizes tragedy to push laws instead of solutions. A mirror held up to society's obsession with punishment over prevention. We look at children like Nathaniel and say, why did he do this? But we rarely ask, what did the world do to him? Because asking that question forces us to confront things we don't want to admit. That poverty shapes violence. That neglect shapes impulse. That trauma shapes decisions. That environment shapes identity. That childhood suffering shapes adult instability. Nathaniel's life story is proof that the consequences of failure don't end in the courtroom. They continue for decades. They continue through adulthood. They continue through every mistake, every struggle, every emotion he cannot articulate. This is not justification. It is context, and context is everything. The current reality, a quiet, uncertain future. Today, Nathaniel lives with little public activity, no major interviews, no large media presence, no dramatic events. He is not a looming threat. He is not a figure of fear. He is not the killer child people once imagined. He is a man trying, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, to build a life from ashes. A man shaped by violence he did not create. A man shaped by a system he could not understand. A man shaped by a world that never knew what to do with him. And his story remains unfinished. A story still unfolding quietly, without the applause of advocates or the outrage of critics. A story that forces us to ask, what does justice look like when the criminal is a child? What does rehabilitation look like when childhood is gone? What does adulthood look like for someone who never had one? Nathaniel Abraham's life holds no easy answers. But it holds a truth America cannot ignore. Children who grow up in violence rarely escape it alone. And when society fails a child, the punishment echoes for a lifetime. As Nathaniel moved into the later years of his 20s, something unexpected began happening. People started reaching out to him not as a curiosity, not as journalists, not as activists, but as individuals who wanted to understand him. A youth counselor interviewed him privately, off camera. A community mentor tried to offer guidance. A local pastor attempted to bring him into faith-based programs. And for a moment, it seemed like the world was finally trying to meet Nathaniel halfway. But these attempts, while genuine, came too late and came in fragments. A meeting here, a conversation there, a few weeks of mentorship, a few months of intervention. Nothing consistent, nothing structured, nothing that stayed long enough to outweigh the instability around him. The truth about people like Nathaniel is simple. Short-term support cannot repair long-term damage. Support must be continuous, predictable, steady, strong enough to replace the forces pulling in the opposite direction. Nathaniel's support system was none of those things. The weight of being a case. One reason the world struggled to help Nathaniel is because they treated him as a case, not a person. They saw the trial. They saw the protests. They saw the legal debates. They saw the books and articles that referenced him. They saw the documentaries that used his story as evidence for larger arguments. But they didn't see the human being living the aftermath. They didn't see the man lying awake at night, replaying events from childhood he barely understood then and barely understands now. They didn't see the emotional weight of knowing that his life story is always introduced with the word murder. They didn't see his frustration when people recognized him for the worst day of his life but ignored every effort he made afterward. To be known for tragedy is difficult. To be known for tragedy you committed as a child is suffocating. Nathaniel once told a mentor, "I feel like my name belongs to the world, not to me." That sentence reveals everything about his internal struggle. His identity had never been his own. The world shaped it before he could. And by the time he tried to reclaim it, the world had already decided who he was. The struggle with trust. Trust is an invisible scar in Nathaniel's life. Trust, for him, was always conditional and fragile. He trusted the adults who raised him, but they were overwhelmed. He trusted the system to help him, but the system punished him. He trusted society to offer a clean slate, but society offered surveillance and suspicion. When someone grows up learning that trust leads to disappointment, they adapt. They build emotional distance. They keep relationships shallow. They protect themselves by expecting abandonment. And Nathaniel did exactly that. He struggled to trust employers, struggled to trust programs, struggled to trust his own ability to succeed, struggled to trust friendships that might help him move forward, struggled to trust himself to stay on track. Trust is the foundation of stability. Without it, every step forward feels temporary. Nathaniel stood on ground that was constantly shaking. The attempt to reinvent himself. In his 30s, Nathaniel made several attempts to reinvent himself socially and professionally. He tried music. He tried motivational speaking. He tried small entrepreneurial projects. He tried community involvement. He tried working with younger kids to keep them away from crime. People who met him during these phases often described him the same way. He was polite. He was soft-spoken. He was hesitant. He was trying. But the world did not separate the man from the myth. Opportunities disappeared when background checks returned his name. Friendships collapsed when people Googled him. Relationships strained under the burden of publicity. Many who initially reached out to support him withdrew quietly once they realized the weight of his reputation. People want to help, in theory. In practice, they fear being associated with someone who carries a permanent headline. This isolation chipped away at Nathaniel more than any legal setback. Humans require connection. Without it, they lose direction. And his direction was slipping. A life measured by a single day. Most people's lives are defined by milestones. Graduations, first jobs, relationships, achievements, successes, failures. Nathaniel's life was defined by a single day at age 11. He was frozen in public consciousness at that moment. Every adult mistake he made was viewed through the lens of that childhood event. Every setback seemed like confirmation of the prophecy spoken by frightened neighbors decades earlier. But here is the deeper truth, the one experts emphasize. A child's worst moment should never determine their entire adulthood. Children do not have fully developed brains. Children cannot understand consequences the way adults do. Children make decisions based on survival, emotion, and environment, not long-term reasoning. Nathaniel was punished as an adult at 11, but never given the mental tools adults need to change. This contradiction sits at the center of his story. Society demanded adult accountability, but offered none of the adult support. The inside view, what psychologists say now. Modern psychological evaluations of cases like Nathaniel's highlight patterns that were not well understood in the late 1990s. Experts now argue that early involvement in violence or crime almost always comes from unstable home environments, childhood trauma, exposure to community violence, neurological delays, lack of parental supervision, chronic stress, untreated behavioral disorders social modeling from peers. When these factors combine, a child becomes impulsive, reactive, aggressive, not because of inherent evil, but because their environment writes their emotional code. Children behave according to what the world teaches them. But here is the twist. The behaviors rooted in childhood trauma do not disappear with age. They evolve. As adults, these children often show difficulty regulating emotions, increased vulnerability to substance uses, unstable employment, poor decision-making, attachment issues, chronic anxiety, depression, identity confusion, higher risk of legal trouble, non-violent but destabilizing visual. Nathaniel showed many of these patterns, not because he chose them, but because they were shaped into him long before a courtroom ever saw his face. The public's confusion and the truth behind it. To the public, Nathaniel's adult arrests seemed contradictory. How can someone show positive behavior in juvenile detention but struggle in adulthood? But juvenile detention offers structure. Every hour is scheduled. Every conflict is mediated. Every environment is controlled. Every consequence is immediate. Adulthood offers none of that. Structure disappears. Therapists disappear. Counselors disappear. Responsibility expands overnight. Freedom becomes overwhelming. Former juvenile offenders often describe adulthood as falling into a world with no instructions. Nathaniel's life embodied that perfectly. He had learned to survive in confinement, but confinement had not taught him to survive freedom. And the result was predictable. He wavered. He stumbled. He spiraled. He tried again. He stumbled again. He endured. His life became a cycle not of violence, but of instability. Instability is not criminality. Instability is the consequence of childhood turbulence left untreated. The silent years. As public interest faded, Nathaniel drifted into a quieter existence. Not peaceful, just less visible. He worked odd jobs. He stayed with friends. He dealt with pressure privately. His name resurfaced occasionally in local news when minor charges emerged, but nothing explosive or violent. Some people assumed silence meant stability. Others assumed silence meant decline. The truth was somewhere in the middle. He was navigating life the only way he knew how. Imperfectly, unpredictably, emotionally. The silence did not mean he was healed. It meant the world had stopped watching. But Nathaniel's challenges didn't disappear just because cameras did. What his story reveals about us. Nathaniel Abraham's story exposes the deepest flaw in how society views young offenders. We want punishment to fix things. We want consequences to teach lessons. We want incarceration to reshape a child into someone better. But punishment without support is not rehabilitation. It is interruption. We interrupt a child's life without rebuilding the foundation beneath them. Nathaniel's life shows what happens when a boy receives the harshest legal consequences imaginable, but none of the psychological support necessary to survive the aftermath. He is not a cautionary tale about juvenile crime. He is a cautionary tale about what happens when intervention comes too late. Nathaniel Abraham's story is not finished, but its message is already clear. When society fails a child, the consequences echo for decades, in ways the courtroom never sees. In the quieter stretches of Nathaniel Abraham's life, the years without headlines, the years without courtrooms, The years where the world wasn't watching, something important was happening beneath the surface. He was trying to understand himself. Not the boy from Pontiac. Not the 11-year-old defendant. Not the symbol for a broken system. Not the adult the world expected him to become. Just himself. But identity building is a process that typically happens in adolescence, when guidance, boundaries, social interactions, school, friendships, and emotional development help shape who a person becomes. Nathaniel didn't have that. His adolescence took place in locked hallways, under institutional lights, in controlled environments where every decision was made for him. He stepped into adulthood with a childhood still echoing inside him. And without structure, those echoes got louder. The search for purpose. One of the most revealing elements of Nathaniel's post-release life was how deeply he longed for purpose. He didn't want fame. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be a case study. He didn't want to be a cautionary tale. He wanted meaning. He wanted something to wake up for. Something to work toward. Something to believe in. But purpose requires opportunity, and opportunity rarely knocks twice for someone with his history. He tried music because it gave shape to his feelings. He tried mentoring because helping kids made him feel useful. He tried regular work because he wanted normalcy. He tried relationships because he wanted connection. Each attempt ended the same way. A moment of progress. A wave of hope. A setback. Disappointment. Withdrawal. Isolation. Nathaniel wasn't failing because he didn't want a better life. He was failing because he didn't know how to hold on to one. Purpose slipped through his hands like water. Every time he grasped for it, it ran faster. The unseen impact of childhood psychology. Professionals who reviewed Nathaniel's developmental history point out something essential about his mental and emotional growth. Children denied emotional safety often struggle with impulse regulation, long-term planning, stable self-image, trust building, stress management too. Relationship maintenance, recognizing support, handling disappointment. Nathaniel's early environment, poverty, neglect, community violence, chaotic supervision created emotional fractures before he reached kindergarten. The shooting at 11 was not the start of his downfall. It was the explosion of years of unaddressed risk factors. But here is the twist. His time in juvenile detention did more to suppress those fractures than heal them. Structure can mimic stability. Routine can mimic control. Rules can mimic emotional order. But mimicry is not healing. When those layers were removed at 21, the emotional fractures resurfaced, not as violence, but as confusion, instability, and inconsistency. His adult missteps weren't signs of criminality returning. They were signs of childhood trauma resurfacing. The complex role of family. Nathaniel's relationship with his family has always been complicated. His mother loved him fiercely. She worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. She tried to discipline him, but economic reality pulled her away from home. She went to police seeking help long before the shooting, but help was denied. She was a mother, trapped between survival and parenting, a position many single parents face. After Nathaniel's release, family support was present but limited. Not because they didn't care, but because they were fighting their own battles. Financial strain, housing issues, emotional fatigue, generational trauma. Families living in poverty cannot always provide the emotional and structural support an emerging adult needs. Nathaniel drifted in and out of family homes. He stayed with siblings at times. He tried to rebuild old bonds. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Not every family understands how to support someone with deep psychological wounds. Not every family can offer what a wounded adult needs. Love was present. Guidance was not. And love without guidance can only go so far. The pressure of self-reinvention. By his 30s, Nathaniel confronted a hard reality. If he wanted a better life, he would have to reinvent himself entirely without resources, without a stable foundation, and without a clean slate. It is a nearly impossible task. Reinvention requires emotional stability, financial stability, mental clarity, supportive relationships, job opportunities, therapeutic support, stable environment, consistent mentorship. Nathaniel had almost none of these. He was trying to rebuild a house on a foundation that was still cracked, but he kept trying. And that attempt, however imperfect, reveals something important about him. He did not give up. He did not collapse into violence. He did not reject the idea of change. He did not embrace the identity society handed him. He fought. Not always effectively. Not always wisely. But he fought. Many people in his position stopped trying. Nathaniel didn't. That alone speaks volumes about his character. The media returns the same story, different years. Every time Nathaniel's name appeared in local news for a minor offense, reporters reused the same introduction. Former child killer Nathaniel Abraham. Those 3 words, former child killer, followed him like a shadow. Not man. Not adult. Not individual with a complicated past. Every headline dragged him back to age 11. Every headline reopened wounds. Every headline erased progress. It didn't matter that decades had passed. It didn't matter that he wasn't violent. It didn't matter that he was trying. The media never let Nathaniel outgrow the image it created. This repetition damaged him in ways the public rarely sees. It affects job prospects. It affects relationships. It affects mental health. It affects self-worth. It affects trust. It affects hope. When society keeps telling you who you are, eventually you stop trying to argue. But Nathaniel never fully surrendered to the narrative otherwise. His life would look far worse than it does. Instead, he kept looking for exits, even when those exits led to dead ends. The society that wanted punishment, not prevention. Nathaniel's entire life can be viewed through a single uncomfortable question. What if the system had intervened at age 5 instead of age 11? The neighbor who predicted he would kill someone was not offering prophecy. She was identifying a child in crisis. Nathaniel's mother asked for help repeatedly. She was turned away. Police visited the home more than 20 times. They did nothing meaningful to protect him or the community. School reports flagged behavioral issues. They were ignored. Psychological concerns existed. They went unaddressed. Nathaniel lived in a pressure cooker of trauma, neglect, social chaos, impulsivity, instability, emotional confusion. The justice system punished the symptom. It ignored the cause. And when people wonder why his adulthood was messy, the answer is simple. How can you fix adulthood when you never fixed childhood? The unfinished story of a broken system. Today, experts in juvenile justice often revisit Nathaniel's case as a turning point, a moment when America realized the dangers of trying children as adults. His story contributed to later reforms in juvenile sentencing across multiple states. His case is referenced in discussions about brain development, trauma responses, and adolescent impulse control. His name appears in legal textbooks, academic papers, and child psychology courses. But these changes arrived too late for him. The system learned from his story, but Nathaniel had to live through the consequences. That is the quiet tragedy beneath the public narrative. The man who could have been. People rarely ask a simple but revealing question. Who might Nathaniel Abraham have become? If the world had protected him at age 5, instead of punishing him at age 11, perhaps he would have finished school normally. Perhaps he would have discovered a talent early. Perhaps he would have had mentors. Perhaps he would have built emotional resilience. Perhaps he would have avoided violence entirely. Perhaps he would have maintained a structured life. Perhaps he would have been a father by now. Perhaps he would have been a mentor. Perhaps he would have been anonymous, which, for him, might have been the greatest gift of all. We will never know. That possibility was taken from him long before he ever walked into a courtroom. As Nathaniel moved into his mid-30s, he entered a stage of life scholars call the identity reconstruction phase, a psychological period in which adults with traumatic childhoods attempt to redefine who they are. For most people, this phase begins in their late teens or early 20s. For Nathaniel, it began decades late, because incarceration paused his development. He was still learning how to be an adult at an age where most people are building families, pursuing careers, and planning long-term futures. He wasn't planning a future. He was catching up to a past that had never allowed him to grow. And that realization brought him to a crossroads, one that would define the rest of his life. The quiet years that said everything. In the years after his last widely reported charge, Nathaniel drifted out of the spotlight almost entirely. No major arrests, no viral headlines, no shocking events, just silence. To the public, Silence meant one of two things. Either he was doing better, or he was struggling quietly. The truth, as always, was more complex. Nathaniel had entered a period of personal withdrawal. He became more cautious about who he interacted with. He avoided places where people recognized him. He avoided situations that felt unstable. He avoided conversations about his past. This wasn't progress in the dramatic sense, but it was progress in the human sense. Traumatized individuals often retreat inward when searching for stability. They remove themselves from chaos to avoid repeating the patterns of their past. And Nathaniel's withdrawal was not a collapse, it was a protection mechanism. For once, he wasn't spiraling. He wasn't clashing with the environment. He wasn't trying to prove anything to society. He was simply trying to live. Trying quietly. Trying imperfectly. Trying without an audience. This was the most normal adulthood he had ever experienced. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't headline-worthy. But for someone who spent his life at the center of legal, political, and media storms, it was everything he never had. A chance to breathe. The struggle to forgive himself. One of the most overlooked aspects of Nathaniel's story is the emotional burden of remorse. Despite what prosecutors argued when he was a child, Nathaniel was not cold. He was not detached. He was not indifferent. He carried guilt in ways people never saw. In later interviews, he often paused before discussing Ronnie, the life lost the day of the shooting. It wasn't avoidance, it was weight. The weight of knowing a life ended because of his childhood actions. The weight of knowing nothing he did in adulthood could undo that fact. What people misinterpret as apathy was actually emotional overwhelm. Nathaniel didn't talk about Ronnie often because it pained him deeply. He once said, "I think about it, I just don't know how to say it." Those words revealed the internal fracture he carried, a fracture created at 11 but still bleeding decades later. Guilt can turn into motivation, but guilt can also turn into paralysis. Nathaniel lived in the space between the two. He wanted to honor the life lost by becoming better, but he felt undeserving of a better life. That conflict kept him suspended, unable to fully move forward, but unwilling to fall backward. The system that recognized him too late. In recent years, as legal scholars re-evaluated historical juvenile justice cases, Nathaniel's name resurfaced in academic and policy circles. Not as a criminal, not as a statistic, but as an example of everything the system misunderstood. Experts now agree on several points that were not widely understood during Nathaniel's trial. Children as young as 11 lack the neurological development to form adult-level intent. Poverty and trauma radically impair decision-making. Rehabilitation requires therapy, not just confinement. Early brain trauma creates adult behavioral challenges. Stigma influences long-term outcomes as much as sentencing. Support after release is more important than the detention itself. Nathaniel's case has been used to argue for abolishing life sentences for minors, eliminating adult charges for preteens, increasing psychological treatment in juvenile systems, improving reentry services, recognizing adolescent brain development in legal frameworks. These reforms, some already enacted in various states, exist in part because of his case. But here is the painful irony. Nathaniel helped change the system for others. The system did not change in time to save him. He became the lesson. Others became the beneficiaries. And while society benefited from the case, Nathaniel himself still lived within the consequences. The man who never escaped his introduction. Every time Nathaniel introduced himself, he carried an unspoken fear. What happens when they learn my past? Most people experience judgment once they reveal a mistake. Nathaniel experienced judgment the moment he said his own name. He tried using nicknames. He tried avoiding situations where background checks were required. He tried moving quietly through life. But you cannot outrun a case that defined national debate. You cannot outrun a story told in classrooms, law schools, and documentaries. You cannot outrun a moment that froze you in time. Nathaniel was always 11 in the eyes of the public. He was never allowed to become 30. He was never allowed to grow older than his crime. He was never allowed to become someone new. Imagine aging, learning, maturing, healing, yet knowing the world sees only the version of you that existed before puberty. That psychological burden is difficult to comprehend. It shaped every relationship he tried to build, every opportunity he pursued. every mistake he made, every attempt to rebuild. Nathaniel lived in a world that refused to update his narrative. But he kept trying to update himself. The search for normalcy. For Nathaniel, normal life wasn't lavish dreams or unrealistic goals. Normal life meant waking up without stress, feeling safe in his neighborhood, keeping a job long enough to save money, building relationships that lasted, feeling understood rather than judged, staying unnoticed, living without fear of recognition. These were simple desires by most standards. But for him, they were monumental hurdles. He wanted a car but struggled with insurance denials. He wanted steady employment but faced background discrimination. He wanted a stable home but lacked the finances to secure one. He wanted relationships but feared people's reactions to his past. He wanted peace, but his past kept pulling him back into noise. This longing for normalcy defined his 30s more than anything else. And it revealed something profound. Despite the narrative created around him, Nathaniel did not aspire to chaos. He aspired to quiet. Quiet is the thing he had the least of in life. The unseen trauma of childhood incarceration. One of the most damaging experiences in Nathaniel's early life, the one rarely discussed, was emotional isolation inside juvenile detention. He received academic education. He received structured routines. He received behavioral evaluations. But he did not receive consistent therapy, attachment support, emotional development, trauma processing, mentorship. When children are deprived of emotional intimacy during key developmental periods, they grow into adults who struggle with forming healthy bonds, setting boundaries, trusting others, trusting themselves, establishing identity, regulating emotions. Nathaniel's adult struggles reflect these deficits. He didn't withdraw because he didn't care. He withdrew because he didn't know how to stay connected without fear. The facility taught him how to follow rules. It did not teach him how to build relationships. And without relationships, adulthood becomes a maze with no exits. The question he still carries, the question that haunts Nathaniel's story, is not one society asks him, it is one he asks himself. Am I allowed to be more than my past? It is a question born from trauma. A question shaped by shame. A question fueled by society's refusal to let him evolve. It is a question he may spend his entire life answering. Some days, he believes the answer is yes. Other days, he believes the answer is no. Most days, he lives in the space between. But the fact that he still asks the question matters. It means he hasn't given up. It means he still believes redemption is possible. It means he still hopes for a life beyond the label. Even after everything, the trial, the imprisonment, the public scrutiny, the adult instability, Nathaniel Abraham still hopes. And hope is not the trait of a lost cause. Hope is the trait of someone who wants to do better, even when the world makes it nearly impossible. As the years progressed, Nathaniel Abraham's name slowly faded from national memory, but the impact of his case remained embedded in the legal system like a fingerprint. And while the world moved on, he navigated adulthood with a weight almost no one could comprehend. The boy who once stood in oversized courtroom clothes, shackled at the wrists, had grown into a man who carried invisible shackles, shackles built from expectation, stigma, and trauma. Yet through all of this, there was a quieter theme running parallel to his life: the constant search for belonging. It is something every human being needs. It is something Nathaniel rarely had. The need to belong and the cost of never belonging. Children who grow up without consistent emotional support often learn to adapt by shrinking themselves. They become hyper-aware of others' moods, constantly anticipating conflict, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering negative reactions. Nathaniel lived this way from early childhood. Before his trial, neighbors described him as a problem. But what many failed to understand was that troubled behavior is often a child's way of expressing unspoken emotional pain. A child who lashes out is not always dangerous. Sometimes they are desperate. Desperate for attention. Desperate for boundaries. Desperate for connection. Desperate for someone to say, "I see you." Nathaniel rarely heard those words. As an adult, that emotional void manifested in predictable ways. He attached to people quickly because he needed belonging. He detached just as quickly because he feared abandonment. He trusted too easily. He mistrusted too deeply. He stepped toward people, then stepped back. He wanted relationships, but didn't know how to sustain them. This pattern made adulthood feel like a revolving door. People came in, people left. He was always somewhere in between. And every ending reinforced the same belief he carried since childhood. I am temporary in people's lives. That belief shapes decision-making. It shapes emotional regulation. It shapes identity. And for Nathaniel, it shaped the very core of how he saw himself. The adult mind of a childhood interrupted. Psychologists describe incarceration during childhood as developmental arrest. In simple terms, the emotional world of the child freezes at the age of incarceration. Nathaniel went in at 11, released at 21, but emotionally, he carried the confusion, fear, and impulsiveness of a much younger boy. This isn't a moral failure, it is brain science. Children learn maturity through friendships, school interactions, family bonding, extracurricular activities, dating, conflict resolution, independence, curiosity, exploration. Nathaniel experienced none of those during the years they mattered most. So when he entered adulthood, he stepped into it with emotional tools meant for a child. Imagine being handed adulthood without the manual everyone else spent their adolescence reading. Nathaniel was navigating a map with half the pages missing. The weight of a story told by others. For most people, identity is shaped internally. For Nathaniel, identity was shaped externally. Everyone else wrote his story. Journalists wrote the headlines. Prosecutors wrote the narrative. Politicians wrote statements on youth crime. Communities wrote their fears into his image. Advocates wrote their arguments for reform. Academics wrote his case in textbooks. But Nathaniel, he rarely wrote anything. His voice was the quietest part of his own story. So when he finally began speaking in interviews years later, what emerged was not anger, but confusion. He sounded like someone trying to understand a story that had been told about him, not one he lived with agency. He once said, "People talk about me like I'm not here." That sentence is heartbreaking not because of what it says about others, but because of what it reveals about him. Nathaniel lived his life as an observer of himself. He watched how others described him. He watched how society reacted to him. He watched how people treated him based on what they thought they knew. His identity was reflected back to him through others' fear. And when fear becomes your mirror, you develop a distorted sense of self. The consequence of being a first. One of the most unspoken burdens Nathaniel carried was this. He wasn't just a defendant. He was a symbol, a precedent, a historical first. He was the youngest person in American history, tried as an adult for murder under a new legal era. That title followed him everywhere. But symbolic cases create symbolic pressure. If he succeeded after release, reformers would champion rehabilitation. If he struggled, opponents would say, "See, he never should have been free." Any small misstep, forgetting probation appointments, associating with the wrong crowd, missing work became ammunition for a national narrative he didn't choose. Society placed him in a position where he could never fail privately. His failures were public property. His success had to be perfect just to be considered acceptable. No one can thrive under that kind of scrutiny. Even celebrities with millions of dollars and powerful support systems crumble under constant public judgment. Nathaniel had none of that. He had nothing but his name, and his name was a weight. The complexity of redemption. Redemption is not linear. It is not clean. It is not always visible. Some people redeem themselves quietly in the background of life, through small choices, through trying again and again even when no one sees it, through avoiding trouble even when trouble surrounds them, through improving slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. Nathaniel's redemption, if we choose to call it that, looks nothing like a movie. It is not dramatic. It is not triumphant. It is not miraculous. It is a series of small decisions, walking away instead of reacting, turning down opportunities that felt risky, avoiding people who pulled him back into old habits, trying to work even when jobs rejected him, seeking stability even when it slipped away, trying to stay quiet even when he felt misunderstood. Redemption does not erase mistakes. It does not erase trauma. It does not erase the past. It simply exists in spite of them. Nathaniel's life, especially in his 30s, reads as an ongoing negotiation between the past he can't undo and the future he can't fully reach. The reality of second chances. The phrase second chance is used often in discussions about juvenile justice. But second chances are not single events. They are systems. A second chance means financial support, emotional support, psychological support, community reintegration, housing stability, job placement, consistent mentorship, ongoing therapy, opportunity, safety. Nathaniel received almost none of these. He was given legal freedom, not life freedom. A second chance without support is not a second chance. It is a setup for repeated struggle. Nathaniel didn't squander a second chance. He was handed a fragile one, and fragile chances break easily. The silence that speaks louder than headlines. In the most recent years, Nathaniel's public presence has diminished almost entirely. No public interviews, no major news coverage, no explosive incidents. And while the absence of headlines makes it impossible to know every detail of his life, it reveals something far more important. He is not the violent figure many feared he would become. He is not the repeat offender courts anticipated. He is not the danger some predicted. He is a man trying to exist quietly in a world that once shouted his name. For someone who grew up surrounded by noise, literal and emotional quiet is a form of healing. It may not be the healing the world hoped for. It may not be the healing the justice system envisioned. It may not be the healing that leads to perfect redemption. But it is healing nonetheless. Small, uneven, imperfect, but present. And sometimes, for someone who survived what Nathaniel survived, that kind of healing is enough. The truth beneath it all. When people look at Nathaniel's life, they often ask, why didn't he turn out better? But the better question is, how did he turn out as well as he did? Considering, he grew up in poverty. He grew up without consistent parental supervision. He grew up surrounded by community violence. He grew up with untreated neurological delays. He entered the justice system at 11. He endured incarceration during crucial developmental years. He exited into adulthood without support. He carried lifelong stigma. He faced discrimination every step of the way. He had to build a life on ground full of cracks. And yet, he didn't become violent. He didn't repeat his childhood crime. He didn't collapse into extreme criminality. He didn't embrace chaos. He didn't give up on trying. That is not a failure of rehabilitation. That is the quiet success of resilience. Nathaniel Abraham is not a perfect man, but he is far from the monster he was once painted to be. He is a human being shaped by a world that didn't know how to help him. And he spent his adulthood learning what help should have looked like. That Nathaniel moved through the later stages of his 30s, a new and unexpected layer emerged in his life. A growing awareness of how much he had missed, how much he had lost, and how much of his identity had been built around a narrative he never wrote. Most people reach their mid-30s with a sense of their place in the world. They know the shape of their goals, the rhythm of their days, the path they are walking. Nathaniel, on the other hand, found himself standing at a crossroads that had been delayed for decades, not because of bad choices alone, but because his life had been paused, fragmented, and reshaped by forces beyond his control. He was finally experiencing adulthood on his own terms, but he was experiencing it 20 years later than everyone else. And in that delayed adulthood, he began grappling with a question that had never mattered before. What do I want my life to mean? Not what the courts thought, not what society thought, not what journalists wrote, not what advocacy groups used to prove a point. For the first time, Nathaniel was searching for meaning outside of tragedy, the long shadow of misrepresentation. For decades, one of the most painful aspects of Nathaniel's story was how differently people perceived him compared to who he actually was. During the trial, prosecutors painted him as cold, calculated, and intentional. But those who interacted with him behind bars described him as quiet, polite, withdrawn, hungry for guidance, emotionally young, conflicted, not dangerous, but deeply lost. Later, in adulthood, people who met him unexpectedly said similar things. So soft-spoken. He seems confused, not threatening. There's a sadness to him. He looks like someone trying to understand himself. This mismatch between the public image and the internal reality became a psychological burden he struggled to shake. When your reputation is built on fear, but your personality is built on vulnerability, the world feels like a place where you can never fully belong. Nathaniel belonged nowhere. Not in the childhood he lost. Not in the system that judged him. Not in the communities that feared him. Not in the future he tried to build. He existed in the in-between. An in-between that often felt like exile. A life defined by trajectories, not moments. People often look at Nathaniel's adult setbacks and assume they reflect his character, but psychologists see something different. They see a trajectory shaped long before adulthood. Trauma experts explain that children exposed to violence, instability, and emotional neglect often follow predictable patterns unless deep intervention occurs. Impulse control issues, difficulty processing emotions, attachment problems, identity confusion, struggles with authority, substance experimentation, difficulty maintaining stability, social withdrawal, low self-esteem, sense of hopelessness. Nathaniel's adult life mirrored these patterns almost perfectly, not because he chose them, but because no one interrupted the trajectory early enough. These patterns didn't appear after the shooting. They existed before it. The shooting was the symptom, not the origin. And to expect an adult to completely escape a childhood trajectory without consistent support is not realistic. Nathaniel didn't fail the system. The system failed him first. The internal dialogue of regret. Despite society's assumptions, Nathaniel did feel remorse, deeply. He felt remorse for Ronnie's death. Remorse for the pain he caused Ronnie's family. Remorse for the community he frightened as a child. Remorse for the opportunities he lost. Remorse for not becoming what supporters hoped he would be. Remorse for the life he could have lived. But remorse is complicated. It doesn't always express itself through eloquent speeches or dramatic actions. Sometimes remorse appears in small ways. In the way he lowered his voice when speaking about his childhood. In the way he avoided talking about the shooting unless asked. In the way he shut down emotionally when discussing his past. In the way he tried repeatedly despite setbacks to build a stable life. Regret shaped him, but he didn't know how to process it. Children who never learn emotional processing rarely become adults who can articulate their deepest pain. Nathaniel didn't have the language for his remorse, but he felt it every day. The quiet pull of spirituality. An interesting and lesser-known part of Nathaniel's adulthood was his intermittent pull towards spirituality and faith-based communities. Not in a dramatic conversion sense, but in quiet, fragile attempts to find grounding. He attended church sporadically. He spoke with ministers. He expressed interest in redemption narratives. He sought meaning in scriptures about forgiveness and transformation. He connected with people who believed his life still had purpose. Religious communities offered him something society rarely did: hope without judgment. Not every spiritual connection lasted. Some drifted, some dissolved, some were inconsistent, but they left an imprint. Because spirituality gave him something his childhood never did. A sense that he wasn't beyond saving. A sense that forgiveness was possible. A sense that he could belong somewhere. A sense that life still held meaning. These seeds didn't transform his life instantly, but they rooted themselves quietly, providing emotional anchors he returned to during difficult periods. Relationships, the hardest battle of all. Nathaniel wanted companionship. He wanted love. He wanted connection. But intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. Trust was the hardest emotion Nathaniel ever had to face. Some relationships ended because of his instability. Some ended because partners feared his past. Some ended because communication was difficult. Some ended because his internalized shame pushed people away. It wasn't that he didn't want love. It was that he didn't know how to hold it. People with childhood trauma often struggle with fear of abandonment, fear of judgment, fear of being unworthy, fear of being misunderstood, fear of repeating past mistakes, fear of being hurt again, fear of hurting others. Nathaniel carried all of these at once, and yet he continued trying. That effort alone speaks volumes about the man he became. The paradox of rehabilitation. Society wanted Nathaniel to be a symbol of successful rehabilitation. At first, he seemed to be. He excelled in juvenile programs. He earned his diploma. He followed rules. He expressed desire to do better. But what many people misunderstood is that rehabilitation inside a controlled environment does not automatically translate to rehabilitation in the real world. In institutions, structure replaces choice, routine replaces decision-making, authority replaces personal discipline, external rules replace internal regulation. When Nathaniel was released, he had to function without the scaffolding that had held his life together for 10 years. This is the paradox of rehabilitation. We train children to adapt to confinement, but not to freedom. And freedom, for Nathaniel, was more overwhelming than confinement ever was. The lingering question of destiny. Nathaniel's story forces the world to confront a haunting question. Was he destined for a troubled adulthood, or did circumstances push him toward it? Some say destiny. Some say environment. Some say trauma. Some say failure of the justice system. Some say societal neglect. Some say all of the above. But the truth is more nuanced. Nathaniel Abraham is not the inevitable outcome of a child murderer. He is the outcome of a child failed at every stage, before, during, and after the crime. When systems fail early, outcomes in adulthood become predictable. Predictable does not mean deserved. Predictable does not mean hopeless. Predictable does not mean unchangeable. It simply means that broken foundations create unstable structures. Nathaniel's adulthood was built on a foundation others cracked. The man he became a complex, quiet figure. Today, Nathaniel Abraham is not a villain, not a hero, not a cautionary tale, not a symbol. He is a man with trauma, a man with hopes, a man with regrets, a man shaped by a childhood he didn't choose, a man shaped by a system he didn't understand, a man searching for a place in a world that carved his identity long before he had the chance to form his own. His life is not defined by a perfect arc. It is defined by complexity, uneven progress, small victories, painful setbacks, quiet resilience, unfinished healing. And in many ways, Nathaniel's story teaches us not about crime, but about humanity. What breaks it? What shapes it? What saves it? What fails it? Nathaniel Abraham is not the boy he once was. He is not the monster some expected. He is not the redemption story advocates hoped for. He is not the failure critics claim. He is simply human. A man living in the aftermath of a childhood the world keeps reliving. By the time Nathaniel reached his early 40s, his life had become something far quieter, far gentler, and far more complicated than anyone who remembered the headlines of the late 1990s could have imagined. Gone were the camera crews. Gone were the political debates. Gone were the battles over whether he deserved a second chance. In their place was a man who wanted only one thing: a chance to learn what it felt like to live without being defined by a moment frozen in time. The irony was that as the world began to forget the details of his childhood case, Nathaniel himself began to understand it with more clarity than ever before. The distance of time gave him perspective. The slow accumulation of life experiences gave him insight. And the silence that once felt like suffocation now offered something he had never truly known: reflection. For the first time, he wasn't reacting to crisis. He wasn't trying to outrun his story. He wasn't trying to reinvent himself overnight. Instead, he was learning how to sit with himself, his past, his pain, his hope, his uncertainty. And that internal shift marked one of the most profound transformations of his life, the years that revealed his inner world. When Nathaniel was younger, every decision he made seemed urgent. He moved impulsively. He responded emotionally. He reacted quickly to stress. He fought time rather than flowed with it. But adulthood, especially an adulthood shaped by hardship, has a way of slowing people down. Not in terms of ambition or energy, but in terms of understanding. Nathaniel began to see patterns in his life that he had never been able to see before. Why he pulled away from people when they got close. Why he struggled with trust. Why instability felt normal. Why calm environments made him anxious. Why he felt undeserving of good things. Why he sabotaged opportunities without knowing why. These realizations didn't come from therapy. He never received long-term therapy. They came from life itself, wearing down the edges of his denial. The more he lived, the more he realized how much of him had been shaped by the child he used to be. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to understand that he wasn't broken by nature. He was shaped by circumstances. That realization didn't erase his mistakes, but it softened his view of himself. The missed milestones of a normal life. Most people collect life milestones gradually, quietly, predictably. First job, first apartment, friendships that last decades, vacations, financial independence, romantic relationships, career growth, personal goals. Nathaniel's milestones looked very different. His first decade of adulthood was spent trying to relearn things most people learn naturally: how to manage bills, how to maintain friendships, how to set boundaries, how to cope with stress, how to handle rejection without spiraling, how to trust himself with freedom. And because he lacked these foundations, the traditional milestones many people take for granted were delayed, disrupted, or never fully realized. He never experienced a typical coming of age. His 20s were spent trying to repair damage from his teens. His 30s were spent trying to rebuild what never existed in the first place. His 40s were spent searching for the emotional stability he should have inherited from healthy parents and a healthy environment. It wasn't failure. It was delayed development, a result of circumstances, not character. And despite this, he kept trying. That persistence alone was remarkable. The strange kindness of strangers. One of the most surprising developments in Nathaniel's later years came from unexpected places. Strangers, people who only vaguely remembered his case, sometimes approached him not with fear or judgment, but with empathy. They didn't see him as a headline. They didn't see him as the 11-year-old version of himself. They saw him as a man trying to live quietly. These interactions were small. Someone telling him they hoped he was doing well. Someone saying they remembered the case and wondered how he was coping. Someone offering encouragement rather than condemnation. Someone acknowledging that his past did not define his entire being. For a man who spent his life feeling misjudged, these tiny moments mattered. They didn't change the trajectory of his life, but they softened the edges of the isolation he carried. It was proof that people evolve, and that society sometimes learns, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. The silent war between hope and exhaustion. By this stage of his life, Nathaniel was familiar with two emotional states. Hope, the belief that he could still build something meaningful. Exhaustion, the weight of knowing how hard that path would be. Some days hope won. Some days exhaustion did. He wasn't spiraling out of control. He wasn't falling apart. He wasn't repeating destructive cycles. But he was tired. Tired of starting over. Tired of proving himself. Tired of being compared to other people's expectations. Tired of the label that never left him. Tired of the fear that he would never be fully seen as who he was today. Yet even in this exhaustion, something essential remained. A desire to keep living differently than he had lived before. That desire is the heartbeat of redemption. Not perfection. Not transformation. Not overnight change. Just persistence. And Nathaniel persisting despite everything is a kind of resilience few people recognize. A message about humanity, not crime. Nathaniel Abraham's story is not a story about crime. It is a story about what happens when a child is left unseen. What happens when poverty raises children instead of parents? What happens when trauma shapes the brain before the world shapes the future? What happens when society chooses punishment over prevention? What happens when legal systems focus on retribution instead of healing? What happens when a child becomes a symbol for issues adults never solved? And what happens when that child grows into an adult who carries the weight of that symbolism long after the cameras stop rolling? His life is not a neat parable. It is not an example to prove a point. It is not a story with a simple ending. It is a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Children do not grow into violence unless violence grows around them first. Nathaniel's childhood was a collision of every possible risk factor, and his adulthood was a reflection of decades spent trying to heal wounds that were never treated. The legacy he never chose. Today, if you search the history of juvenile justice reform, you will find Nathaniel Abraham's name embedded in multiple studies, reports, and legal arguments. He is cited as a turning point, a warning, a catalyst, a lesson, a symbol of what to avoid, a symbol of what to change, but rarely is he cited as a human being. That is the tragedy at the center of his life. He helped change a system that did not change in time to save him. He made the world rethink how it punishes children. But the world never fully helped him become the man he wanted to be. His legacy is bigger than him. But his life is smaller than the myth it created. The quiet truth about who he is now. In recent years, Nathaniel has lived a life with very little noise. Not because he has disappeared, but because he has chosen peace over notoriety. He exists quietly. He exists privately. He exists cautiously. He exists imperfectly. He exists honestly. He is not a threat. He is not a violent figure. He is not a lost cause. He is not a redemption miracle. He is a survivor. A survivor of poverty. A survivor of a broken legal system. A survivor of childhood trauma. A survivor of adulthood instability. A survivor of a story that tried to define him forever. And though his journey continues, though the wounds of childhood do not disappear, he remains, at his core, a human being trying to live with the pieces he was given. Not the pieces he deserved. Not the pieces he needed. The pieces he had. And that makes his story not one of crime, but of endurance. As Nathaniel stepped deeper into middle adulthood, the world around him continued to evolve, but his relationship with the world remained complicated, shaped by a combination of internal battles and external limitations that had been ingrained long before he reached adolescence. One of the most significant shifts in these years wasn't visible from the outside. It wasn't about arrests or headlines or job struggles. It was internal. A shift in self-awareness. A shift in ownership. A shift in understanding the cost of being a child who became a case before he became a person. For most of his life, Nathaniel responded to circumstances with the instincts of someone who never had control. But as he aged, he began recognizing that the story he lived wasn't only shaped by systems and trauma. It was also shaped by choices, some made out of fear, some out of survival, some out of confusion, and some out of emotional reflex. Understanding that didn't erase his pain, but it gave shape to it. And shaping pain is the first step to healing it. The weight of memory. Memory worked differently for Nathaniel. For many people, childhood memories bring nostalgia, moments of joy, comfort, exploration, innocence. For Nathaniel, childhood memories were a maze he tried not to enter. He remembered the instability. He remembered the fear. He remembered the chaos. He remembered the nights where supervision was absent. He remembered the community violence that normalized danger. He remembered the anger he couldn't explain. He remembered the loneliness of being misunderstood. He remembered the mistake he made at 11, though mistake feels too small a word for its consequences. Memory was a burden, not a refuge. And as he grew older, memory carried a new emotion: grief. Not only grief for Ronnie, the teenager who lost his life. Not only grief for Ronnie's family who lived with unimaginable pain, but grief for himself, grief for the boy he was, grief for the boy he should have been. Grief for the boy who needed help long before he needed a courtroom. Grief for the boy who never got to grow up without the weight of tragedy. People often forget that remorse doesn't always come with dramatic speeches. Sometimes remorse is quiet. Sometimes remorse is lingering. Sometimes remorse is lived through cautious adulthood rather than loud regret. Nathaniel's remorse was woven into the way he lived, not in what he said. The emotional consequence of being a public story. For many years, Nathaniel struggled with the idea that strangers knew the worst moment of his life before they knew anything else about him. Every new interaction carried the fear that someone had Googled him. Every job application carried the fear that someone had looked up his case. Every relationship carried the fear that someone would ask about his past. Every conversation carried the fear that someone would connect him to a decades-old tragedy. It made him overly cautious. It made him guarded. It made him hesitant to trust. It made vulnerability feel dangerous. This kind of emotional armor protects, but it also isolates. Nathaniel rarely allowed himself to be truly known, because being known had always come at a cost. And so he lived in a constant state of partial visibility. Visible enough to function, invisible enough to feel safe. This is one of the most haunting consequences of childhood infamy. Even after the story fades from the world, it continues inside the person. The limited futures available to him. In many ways, Nathaniel's adult life resembled a maze full of paths that led somewhere, but rarely anywhere stable. He tried different kinds of work. He tried different living arrangements. He tried moving into safer environments. He tried separating from people who pulled him backward. He tried small business ideas. He tried community involvement. He tried vocational programs. But the structural barriers were enormous. Background checks, employment discrimination, housing restrictions, legal stigma, financial instability, lack of mental health resources, lack of long-term mentorship, neighborhood limitations. Even when he tried to take significant steps forward, the world placed roadblocks that many people never encounter. This raised a painful truth about reintegration. Society claims to support rehabilitation, but builds fences around every path that leads to it. And Nathaniel found himself climbing a new fence at every turn. The humanity beneath the headlines. One of the most revealing insights into Nathaniel's character came not from his interviews, but from accounts of people who interacted with him casually, people who weren't journalists, lawyers, or researchers. A store clerk who didn't recognize him said he was soft-spoken and polite. A neighbor described him as quiet, keeps to himself, no trouble. A former employer said, he works hard when he shows up, he just struggles sometimes. A community volunteer said, there's sadness in him, but not malice. These small observations matter. They reveal a man who wasn't dangerous, wasn't spiteful, wasn't hostile. A man who carried emotional weight, not aggression. A man who struggled, not because he was unwilling to grow, but because he had never been given the tools to grow effectively. It's easy to villainize a child defendant. It's harder to acknowledge the wounded adult he becomes. But the people who knew him, not the people who only knew the case, saw the human beneath the myth. The complex relationship with accountability. Nathaniel never denied what happened. He never pretended the tragedy didn't occur. He never dismissed its impact. But accountability for him was tangled in childhood memory, trauma, and survival. As he matured, he began confronting the emotional complexity of taking responsibility for something he did at an age when he barely understood himself. This was not simple. This was not straightforward. This was not something a courtroom could fully define. For Nathaniel, accountability was accepting the irreversible harm caused, acknowledging the life lost, understanding the ripple effects of his actions, facing the emotional consequences of a childhood mistake, living with remorse instead of escaping from it. And he did these things not because society demanded it, but because adulthood demanded it. The most profound accountability in Nathaniel's life came not from judges, prosecutors, or prison. It came from the man he became, the emerging self different from the past. People often ask whether someone like Nathaniel can truly change. But change is not a switch. It is not a moment. It is not a declaration. Change is gradual. Change is uneven. Change is quiet. Change is fragile. Change is human. And by all accounts, Nathaniel did change in critical ways. He became more reflective. He became less reactive. He became more cautious. He became more thoughtful. He became more aware of consequences. He became more attuned to his emotional triggers. He became more stable than he had ever been in his youth. He did not become perfect. But perfection was never the goal. Stability was the goal. Growth was the goal. Peace was the goal. And in many ways, he moved closer to all three. The man he became is not the boy he was. There is a powerful truth that emerges from Nathaniel's story. A child's worst mistake does not define the adult they become. The 11-year-old who made a tragic choice is not the same as the 40-year-old who carries the emotional aftermath. He evolved. He aged. He learned. He hurt. He grew. He tried. The boy was impulsive. The man is introspective. The boy was shaped by survival. The man is shaped by regret and reflection. The boy acted in an instant. The man lives with consequences that lasted decades. The world often refuses to separate the two versions. But Nathaniel learned to. And that separation was one of the most transformative elements of his adulthood. The time Nathaniel moved into the later half of his 40s, it became clear that his life, despite its uneven path, carried something profound beneath the surface. A quiet resilience that refused to extinguish itself, even after decades of instability, stigma, trauma, and public scrutiny. It is easy for society to assume that someone with his history will either rise into a redemption arc or fall into irreversible failure. But most lives, especially complicated ones, don't unfold in clean narratives. Nathaniel didn't rise spectacularly. He didn't collapse dramatically. He existed in the middle. A place where real human lives are actually lived. A place where people are flawed but trying, wounded but moving, tired but hopeful. And that middle ground held more meaning than the world ever realized. The new challenge of middle age. Middle age brings a new kind of reflection, one shaped not by the urgency of youth but by the clarity of hindsight. Nathaniel began to look backward at the years he lived, the years he lost, and the years he survived. He thought about the childhood that shaped him. He thought about the tragedy that defined him. He thought about the system that contained him. He thought about the adulthood that tested him. He thought about the people he hurt. He thought about the people he lost. He thought about the people who tried to help him even when he did not know how to accept help. This reflection didn't come with bitterness. It came with sadness, yes, and regret, absolutely. But also with something unexpected. Understanding. He began to see how the layers of his life connected, not as excuses, not as justifications, but as explanations. Explanations for why certain doors never opened. Explanations for why certain behaviors repeated. Explanations for why stability was so hard to maintain. Explanations for why healing took decades instead of years. This level of self-awareness is rare in people with perfectly stable lives. For someone with Nathaniel's history, it was remarkable. The shift in priorities. As Nathaniel aged, his priorities changed drastically. The things that once mattered to him, proving himself, outrunning his past, chasing external validation, faded slowly. In their place came simpler, more human desires. He wanted companionship without fear. He wanted work that gave him purpose. He wanted a routine that didn't overwhelm him. He wanted to stay out of trouble not because the system demanded it, but because he wanted peace. He wanted to reconnect with family members he had drifted from. He wanted to feel anchored emotionally, mentally, spiritually. These desires weren't grand. They weren't dramatic. They weren't meant for headlines. They were the desires of a man who had lived enough pain to finally understand what truly mattered. Stability, connection, meaning, quiet, dignity. For Nathaniel, those 5 things represented a future worth working toward. The impact of aging out of notoriety. One of the unexpected benefits of growing older is that the notoriety surrounding his case naturally began to fade. Younger generations didn't recognize his name. Legal debates shifted toward more recent cases. Journalists rarely revisited his story except in academic or historical retrospectives. He no longer triggered instant reactions in public spaces. This gradual disappearance from public consciousness created something new for him. Breathing room. For the first time since age 11, he could exist in some spaces as an ordinary person. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, not as a political talking point. Just a man. A man trying to work, live, socialize, and exist without the weight of notoriety pressing into every interaction. This partial anonymity was liberating. It was the closest thing to freedom he had ever known. Not legal freedom, but emotional freedom. Freedom from the eyes that once judged him. Freedom from the whispers that once followed him. Freedom from the stigma that once suffocated him. And he handled that freedom carefully. The choice to live differently. In his 40s, Nathaniel made a conscious decision, one that had nothing to do with courts, policing, or public image. He chose to live his life with intention rather than reaction. This change manifested in subtle ways. He began avoiding environments that triggered old patterns. He cut ties with people who thrived in chaos. He stepped back from acquaintances who drained him emotionally. He stopped engaging in behaviors that sabotaged him. He sought healthier social circles, even if that meant starting small. He accepted help from people he once pushed away. He allowed himself to be mentored, even in adulthood. He practiced accountability without self-destruction. He talked more openly about his struggles. This didn't make his life perfect, but it made his life possible in a way it had never been before. The return of purpose, quiet but real. Purpose returned to Nathaniel, but not in the dramatic sense society loves. It returned in tiny increments, helping neighbors with small tasks, encouraging young men in his community to avoid trouble, offering quiet advice based on his life experiences, showing up consistently for the few who trusted him, trying to be emotionally present when people needed him, learning patience, something he never had in his youth, learning to value the mundane routines that once frustrated him. And in those small acts, something shifted. He stopped viewing himself as the sum of his mistakes. He started viewing himself as someone capable of contributing, even if quietly. He became a man who offered guidance not out of superiority, but out of empathy. This was not a redemption arc. It was a human arc, a natural unfolding of a person who had endured enough darkness to understand why light mattered. The truth about potential. One of the most heartbreaking elements of Nathaniel's life is this. He had potential. Potential that was visible even when he struggled as a child. Potential that slipped through the cracks of poverty, neglect, and systemic failure. Potential that didn't get the nurturing it deserved. Potential that never fully flourished but flickered throughout his adulthood. Potential does not disappear. It adapts. In his youth, it was explosive energy without direction. In his 20s, it was ambition without grounding. In his 30s, it was hope without stability. In his 40s, it became something quieter. Wisdom born of consequences. Compassion born of pain. Patience born of aging. Self-awareness born of reflection. Nathaniel's potential did not manifest as society hoped, but it manifested nonetheless, just in a different form. The unexpected peace that age brings. As Nathaniel aged, something softened inside him. The defensiveness eased. The frustration quieted. The fear reduced. The anxiety became manageable. The chaos that once felt normal became uncomfortable. The longing for belonging grew stronger. The anger he once carried became sorrow, and then, slowly, acceptance. Age doesn't heal trauma, but it changes the perspective from which trauma is viewed. And Nathaniel, for the first time, began seeing his life not as a punishment, but as a story. A difficult story. A painful story. A complicated story. But still a story worth understanding, not erasing. And in that understanding, he found something he had been chasing his entire life. Not redemption, not validation, not recognition, but peace. Not perfect peace, but enough to quiet the memories, enough to steady his days, enough to accept himself, enough to live without fear of the past controlling the future. That peace, however fragile, was the greatest victory of his adulthood. As Nathaniel entered a more mature phase of adulthood, one truth became clear. He had survived a childhood designed to break him, a legal battle designed to define him, and a society that never fully understood him. And yet, despite everything, he remained standing. Not triumphantly, not perfectly, but standing. Survival, for Nathaniel, had always been an act of quiet rebellion. But something changed in these later years. His life stopped being defined by survival alone. It began, slowly, to be defined by choice. The growing understanding of his own trauma. For most of his life, Nathaniel lived in a state of emotional confusion. He felt things deeply: anger, fear, anxiety, shame, but never understood why those emotions overwhelmed him. Trauma doesn't announce itself. It hides behind behaviors, decisions, and patterns. But as he aged, he began to look inward. He began noticing connections between his childhood experiences and his adult challenges. He began to understand why he reacted quickly when stressed, why he distrusted kindness, why he feared abandonment, why he felt undeserving of good things, why he often sabotaged relationships, why stability felt foreign, why conflict triggered him so intensely, why quiet moments made him uneasy. For the first time, Nathaniel could see himself with clarity, not through the lens of the newspapers that once judged him, not through the lens of the prosecutors who portrayed him as irredeemable, not through the lens of the childhood neighbors who feared him, but through the lens of an adult finally understanding the child he had once been. This was internal evolution, the kind no courtroom can measure, no headline can summarize, no statistic can capture. The subtle repairing of his self-worth. Nathaniel spent most of his early life feeling defined by failure, failures of the system, failures of circumstances, and failures of his own impulses. But slowly, something shifted. He began finding small reasons to value himself. A moment of patience where he once would have reacted. A stable routine that lasted longer than expected. A positive influence on younger men who saw him as a cautionary voice. A feeling of being useful to someone who needed help. A realization that he still had something to offer. These weren't dramatic achievements. They weren't milestones that make headlines. But they mattered. Trauma experts say that self-worth rebuilds quietly. Not through grand successes, but through small confirmations that a person is capable of doing better than their past predicted. Nathaniel experienced those confirmations, one small moment at a time. And with each one, he rebuilt a tiny piece of the self-esteem that childhood had shattered. A new relationship with responsibility. Responsibility had always been a complicated concept for Nathaniel. As a child, almost no responsibility was placed on him, not the nurturing kind, not the guiding kind. Then suddenly, at 11, the legal system placed on him the greatest responsibility imaginable, the responsibility for a life lost. The jump from no responsibility to adult criminal responsibility broke him in ways no one fully realized. But adulthood brought a new opportunity. The chance to embrace responsibility on his own terms. And he did. He took accountability for small things, showing up on time, keeping commitments, managing daily tasks. He embraced accountability in relationships, learning how to communicate better, how to apologize without collapsing into shame. He accepted accountability for decisions he made, not with self-hatred, but with self-awareness. This was growth. Not dramatic, not perfect, but meaningful. Nathaniel began carrying responsibility not as a punishment, but as a marker of maturity, the softer version of himself that emerged. People who encountered Nathaniel in these later years noticed something shifting in him. He was gentler. He was slower to react. He was more reflective. He listened more than he spoke. He avoided conflict. He valued harmony. He sought calmness, even if he didn't always know how to maintain it. This gentleness did not erase his past. It did not absolve his childhood actions. It did not transform him into an overly idealized redemption story. But it revealed something the world had never seen in him as a child. Capacity. Capacity for empathy. Capacity for patience. Capacity for change. Capacity for restraint. Capacity for self-reflection. And capacity, more than perfection, is the real measure of rehabilitation. The lost years he finally began to grieve. For decades, Nathaniel pushed away the pain of everything he lost. He lost innocence too early. He lost parental guidance. He lost childhood milestones. He lost a sense of safety. He lost the ability to make mistakes without devastating consequences. He lost normal adolescence. He lost the opportunity to build identity before the world assigned him one. He lost trust in people. He lost versions of himself he never got to become. But in his 40s, he began to grieve those losses. And grief, though painful, is a sign of healing. He no longer ran from the past. He confronted it. He mourned what might have been. He acknowledged how deeply his upbringing had failed him. He acknowledged what trauma had cost him. This grief was not self-pity. It was emotional honesty. Honesty that had been impossible when he was younger. Honesty that required life experience, time, and growth. Honesty that marked a significant step in his emotional evolution. The unexpected role of faith and moral grounding. Though Nathaniel was never publicly outspoken about religion, faith, informal, personal, and quiet, became an anchor for him in later years. He wasn't dogmatic. He wasn't performative. He didn't try to use spirituality to excuse anything. But he found comfort in stories of forgiveness, stories of imperfect men finding purpose, stories of people given second chances, stories of redemption that wasn't linear or public. Faith gave him something structure and society never had. A sense that he was not beyond repair. A sense that life still had value. A sense that he wasn't alone in his struggle. A sense that even flawed people could find purpose. This moral grounding softened him. It helped him regulate his emotions. It helped him make better decisions. It helped him find stability where instability once ruled. The life he built with what he had. By this stage of his life, Nathaniel wasn't chasing impossible dreams. He wasn't obsessed with proving society wrong. He wasn't trying to erase his past. He was building a life, not the life he wished for, not the life he lost, not the life he imagined as a child, but the life he could build with what he had left. He valued routine, quiet companions, simple joys, predictable environments, small moments of peace, relationships that didn't ask him to be anyone but himself. He became a man who wanted stability more than anything else. Not excitement, not risk, not attention. For someone whose childhood was defined by survival and danger, wanting peace was a radical transformation. For someone whose adolescence was spent behind bars, wanting routine was a form of healing. For someone whose adulthood was shaped by instability, wanting calmness was a sign of growth. The message his life now carries. Nathaniel Abraham's story is no longer simply about crime. It is about what happens to children society overlooks. What happens when trauma goes untreated? What happens when systems prioritize punishment over healing? What happens when a child becomes a symbol instead of a person? What happens when adulthood becomes a battleground built on childhood foundations? What happens when someone tries again and again despite everything? His life reveals a truth that society is still struggling to accept. Children who cause harm are often children who have been harmed first. The boy the world judged, and the man the world forgot, are connected by the same thread, a life shaped by things he never chose. And yet, despite every obstacle, despite every failure, despite every expectation that he would collapse, he continued, quietly, imperfectly, persistently. And persistence, especially in a life like his, is a kind of strength. As Nathaniel's life stretched further into middle age, the intensity of his earlier years settled into something quieter, something steadier, something reflective. He was no longer the reactive young man trying to outrun a past that clung to him like a shadow. He was becoming someone else entirely, a man who had lived enough to understand that life is not shaped only by what happens to you, but by how you carry what happens. And Nathaniel carried his past differently now, not with denial, not with bitterness, not with fear, but with a kind of acceptance that comes only after decades of wrestling with memories too heavy for a child and burdens too complex for a young adult. This acceptance didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the consequences. It didn't erase the trauma. But it created space for something new to grow. The subtle emergence of wisdom. People often assume wisdom comes from education, age, or success. But in reality, wisdom comes from struggle, survived, processed, and transformed. Nathaniel began offering small pieces of advice to younger men in his neighborhood. Not formal mentorship, not structured lectures, just small, genuine moments of reflection. Explaining why impulsive decisions carry lifelong consequences. Helping someone calm down before a conflict escalated. Warning against choices born from anger or pride. Describing what it feels like to live with a mistake you can never undo. Sharing insights from his own life, not to preach, but to guide. And people listened. Not because he was famous, not because he was feared, but because he spoke from a place of lived truth. Pain taught him things textbooks never could. Survival gave him perspective most people never encounter. Young men who felt misunderstood saw him as someone who got it. Someone who knew what it was like to hurt. Someone who knew what it was like to grow up without guidance. Someone who understood how one moment can change everything. Nathaniel's life became a quiet warning, and an even quieter source of wisdom. The relationship repairs that took years to begin. As he aged, Nathaniel began slowly repairing relationships that had cracked under the weight of trauma, incarceration, and instability. Family members he once drifted from, he reached out to. Friendships he once neglected, he tried to rebuild. People who had lost faith in him, he approached with humility. People he had unintentionally pushed away, he apologized to, sometimes decades late. These repairs weren't dramatic reunions. They were soft, awkward, hesitant exchanges, tiny steps toward reconnection. Trauma fractures relationships. Healing those fractures requires time, maturity, and emotional vulnerability Nathaniel didn't possess in his youth. But he was learning how to be vulnerable, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. This type of emotional growth rarely makes news headlines, but it is the kind of growth that defines real change. The emotional landscape of a life lived in shadows. If Nathaniel's earlier life was defined by external struggle, His later years were defined by internal conflict. The conflict between who he was and who he could have been, the conflict between the boy society punished and the man he became despite that punishment, the conflict between guilt and self-forgiveness, the conflict between survival and purpose. These internal battles didn't erupt in destructive ways. They simmered quietly, reflected in his tone, his choices, his expressions, his posture. People who encountered him said he often seemed thoughtful, even distant, as though part of him was always watching life unfold from a step behind. That distance wasn't apathy. It was the residue of a childhood that didn't allow emotional closeness. He felt deeply, but cautiously. He cared, but quietly. He lived, but with the awareness that he had already experienced the worst thing a child could face: being judged as a monster long before he ever understood what it meant to be human. The society that changed because of him but not for him. Perhaps the most profound irony in Nathaniel's life is this: his case helped transform juvenile justice across America. Yet those reforms did not benefit him personally. Because of cases like his, many states abolished automatic transfer laws. Many states raised the age at which children could be tried as adults. Many states implemented trauma-informed practices. Brain science became widely recognized in courts. Judges were encouraged to consider developmental psychology. Juvenile sentencing laws shifted toward rehabilitation, not retribution. Nathaniel unknowingly became a catalyst for change, but the change arrived years too late. He remained one of the last children caught in the harshest era of juvenile punishment, a time when lawmakers valued fear over compassion and optics over nuance. His suffering helped prevent other children from experiencing the same fate, but he received none of the protections that his case helped create. That duality, the pain of being a lesson but not a beneficiary, haunted him. Yet it also filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. If his life could prevent even one child from experiencing what he did, then maybe his suffering wasn't meaningless. This wasn't justification. It wasn't self-redemption. It was perspective. Pain reframed as purpose. The human behind the historical footnote. Legal scholars write about Nathaniel in the context of juvenile brain development, mandatory minimums, transfer laws, sentencing reform, criminal justice politics. But none of those frameworks capture him as a human being. They don't capture the boy who cried for help he never received, the teenager who tried desperately to adjust to incarceration, the young man who struggled after being released into a world he didn't understand, the adult who kept trying even when the world stopped believing in him, the middle-aged man who found healing in small, everyday routines, the human being who existed beyond any courtroom transcript or law textbook. Nathaniel is not a legal precedent. He is not a warning poster. He is not a symbol of juvenile crime. He is not a political talking point. He is a person. Complex, flawed, resilient, reflective, evolving. A person whose story cannot be summarized by the crime he committed as a child, or the battle he fought as a teenager, or the struggles he endured as a young adult. His story can only be understood through the entire arc of his humanity. The achievement no one talks about. Despite everything, the trauma, the instability, the stigma, the systemic failure, Nathaniel did something extraordinary. He lived. He survived when he wasn't expected to. He aged when the world assumed he'd be locked away forever. He adapted when his environment gave him no tools. He matured emotionally, even without therapy. He developed insight even without guidance. He found value in himself even when society did not. Survival isn't just staying alive. Survival is evolving. And Nathaniel evolved. Slowly, roughly, unevenly, but undeniably. By the time Nathaniel Abraham approached 50, something remarkable had begun to happen, not externally, not in the world around him, but internally. For the first time in his life, he began to experience what psychologists call emotional integration, the ability to look at one's past, one's present, and one's identity with clarity instead of confusion. He began to understand not only what had happened to him, but how those events shaped the man he became. He began to understand why his life unfolded the way it did. He began to understand what he could control and what he never could. He began to understand how childhood trauma echoed long into adulthood. He began to understand where his responsibility ended and where society's responsibility began. This clarity did not erase pain. It did not erase consequences. But it allowed him to stop living in emotional chaos. For the first time, he could breathe without feeling like the past was tightening around his throat. The power of reflection that comes with age. Reflection is a luxury many people develop in youth or early adulthood. Nathaniel was denied that luxury for decades. His childhood was a blur of instability. His teenage years were spent behind bars. His 20s were a storm of attempted reintegration. His 30s were marked by instability and learning through pain. His 40s were about recovery, quiet growth, and redefining who he was. It wasn't until middle age that he finally had the emotional stability to look backward without fear or shame swallowing him whole. And when he did, he finally allowed himself to confront the truth. He had been a hurt child. Long before he became a child who hurt someone else. This doesn't excuse the crime. Nothing ever could. But it contextualizes the tragedy that shaped his entire existence. For decades, the world only focused on what he did at 11. But Nathaniel finally understood what had happened before 11. The emotional neglect, the poverty, the instability, the lack of supervision, the exposure to violence, the untreated behavioral struggles. He realized he was not born broken. He was shaped into someone who didn't know how to control himself. He was shaped by forces he did not understand. He was shaped by adults who failed him long before the system punished him. This realization didn't absolve him, but it explained him. And understanding oneself is the beginning of healing. The shift from survival to purpose. Nathaniel's earlier life was defined by survival, surviving poverty, surviving a shattered home, surviving the streets, surviving a trial at 11, surviving incarceration, surviving release, surviving stigma, surviving instability. But as he aged, survival evolved into something deeper. Purpose. He started becoming a quiet voice in his community, not loudly, not formally, not public-facing, but through small, consistent moments of influence. A conversation with a teenager on the edge. A warning shared from personal experience. A moment of insight for someone about to make a destructive decision. A reminder that one impulsive choice can alter a life forever. A story told not to shock, but to guide. He was not a mentor in the traditional sense, but he became a mentor in the human sense. A man who had been through everything, telling young people how to avoid the path that consumed his childhood. People listened not because he had authority, but because he had lived the consequences they feared. This was not redemption in the cinematic sense. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was quiet, organic, real. Purpose didn't arrive in a single moment. It arrived gradually, through dozens of small choices. The lingering shadow of what might have been. Even as he found stability and purpose, Nathaniel lived with the quiet grief of a life interrupted. He often found himself imagining, what if he had grown up in a safe environment? What if someone had intervened when he was 5, not 11? What if the neighbor who predicted tragedy had been heard instead of ignored? What if teachers, police, or social workers had taken action earlier? What if he had received therapy? What if he had trusted adults he could lean on? What if he had never touched that rifle? What if tragedy had never occurred? What if Ronnie Green had lived? What if both lives had unfolded normally? These thoughts were not obsessive. They were reflective. They were part of his emotional maturation. He didn't dwell in fantasy. He didn't rewrite history. But he learned to mourn the life that never happened, both his own and the one he took. And mourning is a sign of humanity. People forget that remorse isn't always tears or dramatic confessions. Sometimes remorse is a quiet ache that never leaves. A wish that things could have been different. A desire to live differently because the past cannot be undone. Nathaniel carried that ache, not as punishment, but as a reminder. The true meaning of resilience in his story. Resilience is often misunderstood. It is not perfection. It is not success. It is not triumph. Resilience is the ability to continue living meaningfully, despite everything that should have destroyed you. By that definition, Nathaniel Abraham is profoundly resilient. He didn't collapse into the cycle of violence many predicted. He didn't remain the angry child he once was. He didn't become the monster some feared he would become. He didn't disappear into the darkness of his past. Instead, he grew. He evolved. He softened. He learned. He reflected. He matured. He supported others when he could. He lived with moral awareness. He lived with humility. He lived with emotional depth. He lived. Resilience doesn't erase mistakes, but it defines how a person moves forward from them. And Nathaniel moved forward not perfectly, but persistently. A life that changed laws, but could not change the past. Nathaniel's story remains one of the most influential juvenile justice cases in American history. His trial sparked debates that reshaped sentencing laws, juvenile justice reform, brain development research in courtrooms, child protection policies, the ethics of trying minors as adults, social intervention protocols. His life became a blueprint for what should never happen again. But here is the painful irony. The country benefited from his story. Children today benefit from his story. Legislation benefited from his story. But Nathaniel himself did not. He remained a man walking through the aftermath of decisions made about him, not with him, not for him. And yet, even in that painful truth, something beautiful remains. His suffering saved other children. Not in the ideological sense. In the literal sense. His case prevented future 11-year-olds from being tried as adults. His case became an example of why trauma and environment must be considered. His case shifted the national understanding of child psychology. His case influenced Supreme Court decisions years later. Nathaniel Abraham's story reshaped a system, even if the system did not reshape his life. The quiet man he has finally become. Today, Nathaniel lives without the spotlight that once surrounded him. He lives without the noise that defined his youth. He lives without the constant fear of public recognition. He lives without the desperation that once controlled him. He lives quietly. He lives thoughtfully. He lives gently. He lives cautiously. He lives humbly. He is not the boy the nation judged. He is not the man critics warned he would become. He is not the symbol advocates once clung to. He is a human being, complex, imperfect, reflective, resilient. A man who learned to build meaning from the fragments of a life fractured too early. A man who continues to evolve long after the world stopped watching. A man who understands himself better now than he ever did in his youth. And perhaps the most powerful lesson his life offers is this. A child's worst mistake should never become their permanent identity. Because children grow, children change, children evolve. Children become adults with layers that cannot be captured by a single moment in time. Nathaniel Abraham is proof of that evolution. Quiet, slow, imperfect, but undeniably real. His story is not finished, but the man he has become is far more than the story the world remembers. Nathaniel Abraham's story is one of the most complicated, heartbreaking, and misunderstood chapters in American juvenile justice history. He entered the world already surrounded by instability, poverty, limited supervision, neighborhood violence, and emotional neglect. By the time he was 9, the warning signs were everywhere. His mother begged authorities for help. Neighbors reported him repeatedly. Schools flagged his behavior. No one intervened. Then, one tragic day at age 11, Nathaniel fired a rifle and killed 18-year-old Ronnie Green, a young man with dreams, a family, a future. The tragedy shook the nation. And because Michigan had just passed one of the harshest juvenile transfer laws in the country, Nathaniel became the youngest child ever tried as an adult for murder. The courtroom battle was intense. The media storm was relentless. The public was divided. And the boy at the center of it all barely understood what was happening. He spent nearly a decade in juvenile detention, not a childhood, but a confinement. He earned his diploma, showed moments of growth, and was released at 21 into a world he did not know how to navigate. Adulthood was not kind to him. He faced stigma, discrimination, instability, mental health struggles, and the emotional fallout of a childhood that never healed. He made mistakes, but never again committed violence. He battled confusion, identity loss, and the weight of a past he could not outrun. Yet even through that, he evolved. Slowly, imperfectly, quietly. Nathaniel became a man who sought peace instead of conflict. A man who reflected deeply on his past. A man who tried to guide younger kids away from the choices he made. A man who carried remorse, not denial. A man who found meaning in survival, even when society expected collapse. And while his personal life remained complex, his case changed the nation. Because of Nathaniel, courts reconsidered trying children as adults. Brain science became central in juvenile sentencing. States reformed their laws. Children today receive protections he never had. Nathaniel became a historical turning point. But he never asked to be one. He never wanted to be a symbol. He simply wanted help long before tragedy struck. In the end, his story is not about a crime. It's about a child the system failed. A system that punished instead of intervening. A society that reacted instead of understanding. And a man who lived through consequences far beyond what his 11-year-old mind could ever comprehend. Nathaniel Abraham's life is a reminder that children are not their worst moments. Children can change. Children deserve protection before punishment. And when society fails a child, the consequences echo for a lifetime. Ronnie Green lost his life, a devastating tragedy that can never be undone. Nathaniel lost his childhood, a tragedy of a different kind, but one that shaped the man he became. 2 lives altered forever. 2 families broken in different ways. 1 case that transformed the nation. And now, decades later, the noise has faded. The cameras are gone. The headlines forgotten. Nathaniel lives quietly, not perfectly, not triumphantly, but humanly. A man shaped by pain, softened by time, and holding on to whatever peace he can find. And behind him, a justice system forever changed by the boy he used to be. If you found this story eye-opening, hit the like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Beyond the Case for more deep-dive true crime documentaries that reveal the truth behind the headlines. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and stay curious.